Your brain makes thousands of decisions every day, but what if most of them aren't really yours? In this video, you're about to dive into 3 hours of emotional shortcuts your brain never questions. The hidden mental tricks shaping how you think, feel, and react. Before we continue, let us know what time it is for you and where you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoy long-form, thoughtful videos like this, please like the video and subscribe to our channel, Restwise. These videos take a lot of time to make, and your support genuinely means a lot to us. Now get comfy and enjoy the video. Why the brain trusts familiar pain over unknown happiness. Think about the last time you stayed in something that clearly hurt you. A job that drained you. A relationship that made you feel small. A routine that slowly numbed you. What is strange is not that it hurt. What is strange is how familiar it felt. Almost safe. Like you knew exactly how much pain was coming and when. That is where the trap begins. Your brain did not choose this because it wanted you miserable. It chose it because it recognized it. Familiar pain feels predictable, and predictability is comfort to the brain, even when it costs you happiness. Here is the uncomfortable part. The brain does not actually care about your happiness. It cares about your survival, and survival is about reducing uncertainty. Unknown happiness is a wild card. It asks you to step into a version of life where you do not know the rules yet. New relationships mean new risks. New opportunities mean new ways to fail. New joy means new things you could lose. To the brain, that is dangerous territory. Familiar pain, on the other hand, is mapped. It knows how to brace for it. It knows what thoughts to think and what emotional armor to wear. There is no surprise. And the brain hates surprises more than it hates pain. This is why people stay stuck, even when the exit is obvious. Someone grows up in emotional chaos and later chooses partners who recreate that same tension. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because calm feels suspicious. Calm feels empty. Calm feels like something bad must be coming next. The brain learned early that love equals volatility, so stability feels wrong. Another person stays in a job they complain about every single day, not because they lack ambition, but because they know exactly how that misery works. They know how to survive Mondays. They know how to numb themselves on Fridays. The idea of starting over activates uncertainty, and uncertainty activates fear. Inside your brain, there is a system constantly scanning for threats. It evolved to keep you alive in environments where the wrong move could get you killed. That system does not update itself just because modern life is safer. When you face something new, that system lights up. Your heart rate shifts. Your muscles tense. Your thoughts look for reasons to stop. Meanwhile, familiar pain does not trigger the same alarm. It already knows the outcome. Even if the outcome is sadness, the brain prefers a known loss over a possible one. This creates a cruel illusion. You start to believe that this is just who you are. You tell yourself you are bad at relationships or unlucky or not the kind of person who gets more. But what is really happening is conditioning. The brain reinforces what it already understands. Every time you choose the known discomfort over the unknown possibility, the neural pathways get stronger. It becomes easier to repeat. Not because it is right, but because it is efficient. And here is where it gets personal. If you have ever felt drawn back to something that hurt you, even after promising yourself you were done, you are not broken. You are human. Your brain is doing what it was designed to do, which is minimize risk. The problem is that your brain defines risk very differently than your heart does. To your heart, risk is staying where you slowly disappear. To your brain, risk is stepping into something you cannot predict yet. This is also why advice like just leave or just go for it feels useless. Your nervous system is not convinced. Logic alone does not override survival programming. Until the brain believes that the unknown is safe enough, it will keep pulling you toward what it recognizes, even if it hurts. That pull can feel like intuition, but it is not wisdom. It is familiarity wearing a disguise. The shift begins when you realize that comfort and safety are not the same thing. Comfort is what you know. Safety is what actually allows you to grow without constant damage. The brain confuses the two because for most of human history, they overlapped. Today, they often do not. The brain still reaches for the familiar, but the familiar might be the very thing keeping you small. If you have ever wondered why change feels harder than staying miserable, this is why. Your brain is not sabotaging you. It is protecting an outdated definition of survival. And once you see that, you start to notice something subtle. The fear you feel about unknown happiness is not a warning sign. It is a doorway. How repetition turns lies into emotional truth. At some point in your life, a thought crossed your mind that felt so real you never questioned it. Maybe it was I am not good enough, or people always leave, or this is just how life is for me. What is wild is that no one may have ever said it out loud to you. Or maybe they said it once, years ago, but now it lives in your head like a fact. Not an opinion. Not a fear, a truth. That is not because it was proven. It is because it was repeated. Your brain does not have a built-in lie detector for thoughts. It has something far more primitive. Familiarity. When an idea shows up again and again, the brain stops checking it. It assumes if it keeps appearing, it must be important, or accurate, or both. This is how repetition quietly rewires belief without asking for permission. A lie repeated enough times does not feel like a lie anymore. It feels obvious. Here is the part most people never realize. Emotional truth is not the same as factual truth. Emotional truth is what feels real in your body. It is the thought that triggers a reaction before logic even has time to speak. Your chest tightens. Your stomach drops. Your behavior changes automatically. That reaction did not come from evidence. It came from rehearsal. The brain learned the feeling first and built the belief around it later. This starts early. A child hears subtle messages through tone, behavior, silence. Maybe they are ignored when they speak. Maybe praise is rare and criticism is common. The child does not think my parents are stressed or emotionally unavailable. The child thinks I do not matter. That thought is not formed once. It forms every time the experience repeats. Over time, the brain wires that idea into the emotional system. By adulthood, it is no longer a thought. It is a lens. Repetition strengthens neural pathways. Each time a thought runs through your mind, the connection gets faster and smoother. The brain loves efficiency. It will choose the well-worn path every time. This is why negative self-talk feels automatic. You did not choose it consciously. You practiced it unconsciously. The brain learned that this is the default story. And once something becomes the default, it shapes behavior. If you believe emotionally that you are unlovable, you might tolerate poor treatment because it matches the story. If you believe you always fail, you might hesitate just enough to sabotage opportunities. Then, when the outcome matches the belief, the brain says, "See." Proof. The loop tightens, not because it was true to begin with, but because repetition made it self-fulfilling. There is also a social layer to this. Humans are wired to absorb beliefs from their environment. If you grow up hearing the same messages around you about money, success, relationships, or worth, your brain does not analyze them. It mirrors them. When everyone around you treats an idea as obvious, your nervous system accepts it as reality. Repetition plus social reinforcement is one of the strongest forces the brain knows. This is why propaganda works, why stereotypes persist, why people defend beliefs that harm them. The brain mistakes frequency for truth. The more often something is heard, the less mental effort it takes to process. And the easier something is to process, the more true it feels. This is not a flaw in your character. It is a feature of your cognition. Now here is the unsettling part. Once a belief becomes emotionally true, facts alone rarely undo it. You can know logically that you are capable, loved, or safe, and still feel the opposite. That is because logic lives in one part of the brain, and emotional truth lives in another. Repetition trained the emotional brain, not the rational one. But here is where the power shifts. The same mechanism that turns lies into emotional truth can be used in reverse. The brain does not care whether the repetition is negative or positive. It cares that it is consistent. When new thoughts are introduced gently and repeatedly, the brain starts to soften. At first they feel fake, uncomfortable, even irritating. That discomfort is a sign you are stepping off the old neural path. This does not mean affirmations magically work overnight. It means emotional truth changes through experience plus repetition. When a new belief is paired with small actions, small evidence, and repeated exposure, the emotional brain starts updating its map. Not because you forced it, but because you showed it something new often enough that it could no longer ignore it. If you have ever wondered why a belief still controls you even though you know better, this is why. You are not weak. You are trained, and training can be changed. The most dangerous lies are not the loud ones shouted at you. They are the quiet ones you repeat to yourself so often that your brain stops, asking whether they are real at all. The comfort illusion. Why safety feels better than growth. There is a strange moment that happens right before growth. Everything in you tightens. Your chest feels heavier. Your mind suddenly becomes very reasonable. You start listing why now is not the right time, why you should wait, why staying exactly where you are makes sense. That feeling is often mistaken for wisdom, but most of the time it is just comfort protecting itself. The illusion is subtle. Safety feels good in the body. It feels calm, familiar, controlled. Growth does not. Growth feels awkward and destabilizing. It brings uncertainty, exposure, and the possibility of embarrassment or loss. So when given the choice, Your brain votes for safety and calls it logic. It tells you that you are being smart, cautious, mature. What it does not tell you is that it is afraid of rewiring itself. The brain equates safety with what it already understands, not with what is actually good for you long term. This is why routines that slowly drain you can still feel soothing. You know the rhythm. You know the emotional costs. You know how to survive them. Growth threatens that predictability. It asks your nervous system to operate without a script, and the nervous system hates that. Here is where the illusion deepens. Comfort often disguises itself as peace, but peace is restorative. Comfort can be numbing. If something keeps you from feeling alive, but also keeps you from feeling afraid, the brain will choose it. Not because it leads to fulfillment, but because it reduces immediate threat signals. Growth increases those signals temporarily. Heart rate rises. Doubt gets louder. Old fears resurface. The brain interprets this as danger, even when nothing bad is actually happening. Think about how people talk themselves out of change. They say things like, "I am fine where I am," or "it could be worse," or "I do not want to risk what I already have." None of those statements are lies, but they are incomplete truths. They focus entirely on avoiding pain and completely ignore the cost of staying the same. The brain is very good at calculating short-term safety and very bad at calculating long-term stagnation. There is a psychological mechanism at play here. The brain learns to associate familiarity with safety because familiar environments have not killed you yet. That is literally the bar. It does not ask whether the environment helped you thrive or grow or express yourself fully. It only asks whether you survived it. So when growth threatens to pull you out of the familiar, the brain reacts as if you are walking into danger, even if the danger is just emotional discomfort. This is why people often feel anxious doing things they actually want. Starting something meaningful, speaking honestly, leaving situations that no longer fit. The anxiety does not mean it is wrong. It means your nervous system is being asked to update its definition of safety, and updates always feel unstable at first. Comfort becomes an illusion when it convinces you that feeling calm is the same as being aligned. You can be calm and deeply misaligned. You can be comfortable and slowly shrinking. The absence of fear does not equal the presence of fulfillment. But the brain struggles to tell the difference because fear is loud and fulfillment is subtle. What makes this even more convincing is that growth rarely feels rewarding at the beginning. The brain likes rewards it can feel immediately. Growth delays gratification. It asks you to endure discomfort now for a payoff you cannot fully visualize yet. Comfort offers a guaranteed emotional pattern. Growth offers uncertainty, and the brain always prefers a known emotional pattern over an unknown outcome. This is why many people say they want change but never move. It is not a motivation problem. It is a safety conflict. One part of you wants expansion. Another part wants regulation. And until safety is redefined, regulation wins. The brain would rather keep you emotionally flat than emotionally exposed. The shift happens when you start noticing the difference between being safe and being stagnant. Stagnation has a particular feeling, a low-grade restlessness, a sense of watching life instead of participating in it. Comfort numbs that feeling just enough to make it tolerable. Growth, on the other hand, wakes it up. That awakening can feel uncomfortable, even painful, because it reminds you of what you have been avoiding. If you ever feel pulled back toward comfort, right when something meaningful is within reach, that is not a coincidence. That is the illusion tightening its grip. The brain is trying to preserve a version of safety that no longer serves you. And the moment you realize that, comfort loses some of its authority, because you start to see that what feels safest is not always what keeps you alive in the ways that actually matter. Emotional certainty bias, believing feelings more than facts. There is a moment when a feeling hits so hard that it settles the argument instantly. You do not analyze it. You do not debate it. You just know. It feels obvious, certain, final. And in that moment, facts do not stand a chance. That is emotional certainty bias at work. The brain treats strong feelings like evidence, even when they are not. Most people assume they make decisions based on logic and then feel something about it later. In reality, it is usually the opposite. A feeling shows up first, fast and loud, and the mind rushes in afterward to justify it. When a feeling is intense enough, the brain labels it as truth. Not a signal, not a reaction, a truth. Once that happens, facts that disagree are dismissed or twisted until they fit the feeling. This is why you can feel absolutely certain about something and still be wrong. The certainty does not come from accuracy, it comes from intensity. The emotional brain evolved to prioritize speed over precision. In early survival situations, hesitation could kill you. So the brain learned that strong internal signals should be trusted immediately. That wiring never left. Now it applies the same rule to modern life, even when the threat is emotional rather than physical. Here is where it gets tricky. Emotional certainty feels like clarity. It feels grounded. It feels like finally seeing things clearly. But clarity is calm and flexible. Emotional certainty is rigid. It locks you into a conclusion and resists updates. Once you feel certain, your brain stops searching for information. It assumes the answer has already been found. Think about jealousy. Someone feels a sudden wave of it and instantly believes something must be wrong. The feeling becomes proof. Or anxiety. A situation triggers it and the brain concludes this is dangerous. Or shame. It rises and suddenly the belief I did something wrong feels undeniable. In each case, the feeling is real, but the story attached to it is optional. Emotional certainty bias removes that distinction. The brain has a shortcut here. It assumes that feelings are accurate representations of reality rather than interpretations of it. That shortcut saves energy. Questioning emotions takes effort. Accepting them as truth is efficient. So when a feeling is repeated or reinforced, the bias grows stronger. The brain learns that this feeling equals this conclusion, and it stops checking. This is why arguments fueled by emotion are so hard to resolve. Each person feels right, not because they have better facts, but because their nervous system is convinced. Emotional certainty shuts down curiosity. It replaces wondering with defending. And once that happens, even clear evidence feels threatening because it challenges the emotional foundation. There is also a memory effect. Emotions shape what you remember and how you remember it. When you feel certain about something, your brain selectively recalls moments that support that feeling and filters out the rest. Over time, your memory becomes biased evidence. You look back and think it has always been this way, when in reality you are only remembering what matches the emotion. This bias shows up strongly in self-perception. If you feel like a failure, every setback confirms it. If you feel unlovable, Every delay or misunderstanding becomes proof. The feeling leads, and the facts are recruited after. Even compliments bounce off because they do not match the internal certainty. The brain trusts the feeling more than the data. And here is the part that feels personal. Emotional certainty often forms during moments of vulnerability. A painful experience paired with a strong emotion teaches the brain a lesson. The lesson feels protective. Do not trust. Do not try. Do not hope. The certainty feels like armor. It prevents future disappointment, but it also prevents revision. Once armored, the brain resists any information that would require it to soften. The problem is not that emotions exist. Emotions are information. The problem is when the brain treats them as conclusions instead of signals. Fear can mean danger, or it can mean unfamiliar. Sadness can mean loss, or it can mean unmet needs. Anxiety can mean something is wrong, or it can mean something matters. Emotional certainty bias collapses all of that complexity into one rigid answer. The shift begins when you notice the difference between feeling true and being true. Something can feel absolutely real in your body and still be incomplete. When you pause and ask what else could be true alongside this feeling, you create space. That space weakens the bias. It tells the brain that emotions are important, but not authoritative. This does not mean ignoring feelings. It means slowing down before building a belief on top of them. When emotional certainty loosens its grip, curiosity returns. You can hold a feeling without letting it dictate the verdict. And that is where growth starts. Not by silencing emotion, but by refusing to let intensity masquerade as truth. How the brain confuses intensity with importance. There is a reason certain moments hijack your attention instantly. A sharp comment, a sudden fear, a burst of anger or excitement. It feels urgent, like it demands a response right now. Your body reacts before you have time to think, and in that moment, your brain makes a quiet assumption. If this feels intense, it must be important. That assumption shapes far more of your life than you realize. The brain is built to prioritize intensity because, for most of human history, intense signals meant survival was at stake. A loud noise, a fast movement, a surge of fear. Those moments required immediate action. The brain learned that intensity equals relevance. The stronger the signal, the faster the response. That wiring still runs the system today, even though most modern intensity is emotional, not life-threatening. Here is where the confusion begins. Emotional intensity does not always come from importance. It often comes from novelty, insecurity, or unresolved experiences from the past. But the brain does not slow down to check the source. It reacts to the volume. When something hits hard emotionally, the brain elevates it to the top of the priority list. Quiet signals get ignored. Subtle needs get postponed. Long-term goals get overshadowed by whatever feels loudest in the moment. Think about how easy it is to obsess over a single negative comment while ignoring dozens of neutral or positive ones. The negative comment carries more emotional charge. It stings. It triggers threat responses. So the brain zooms in on it and treats it as more meaningful. Not because it represents reality better, but because it activates the nervous system more strongly. This plays out constantly in decision-making. People chase intense relationships that feel passionate but unstable, mistaking emotional spikes for depth. Calm, healthy connections can feel boring at first because they do not trigger the same highs and lows. The brain interprets the lack of intensity as lack of importance. when in reality it might be a sign of safety and consistency. The same thing happens with fear. Anxious thoughts feel urgent. They come with physical sensations. Tight chest, racing heart. Because the sensation is strong, the brain assumes the threat is real and immediate. It does not stop to ask whether the fear is proportional. Intensity short-circuits perspective. There is also a dopamine component here. The brain releases dopamine in response to anticipation and emotional spikes, not just pleasure. Intense experiences create stronger dopamine signals, which makes the brain tag them as worth paying attention to. This is why drama is addictive, why outrage spreads faster than calm analysis, why scrolling through emotionally charged content keeps you hooked longer than steady, meaningful information. The brain is being trained to equate stimulation with significance. Over time, this creates a distorted internal compass. You start making choices based on what feels strongest rather than what matters most. You react instead of reflect. You prioritize urgency over alignment. Important but quiet things like health, purpose, and values get sidelined because they do not scream for attention. They whisper, and the brain is not good at listening to whispers. This confusion is especially powerful when intensity is tied to identity. If a situation triggers shame, anger, or validation, it feels personal. The brain flags it as high stakes. You might spend hours replaying a conversation, not because it actually changed your life, but because it activated something unresolved inside you. The intensity comes from history, not importance, but the brain treats it as if the present moment is everything. This is why people often feel exhausted without knowing why. They are constantly responding to emotional alarms that are loud but not meaningful. The nervous system stays activated, chasing or avoiding intense feelings, while deeper needs remain unmet. Intensity drains energy. Importance sustains it. There is a subtle cost here. When intensity becomes your guide, you lose patience for slow growth. Anything that does not provide immediate emotional feedback feels pointless. Learning, healing, building something meaningful. These processes are often uncomfortable but not dramatic. They require consistency, not spikes. The brain, trained to seek intensity, resists them. The shift starts with noticing what consistently gets your attention. Ask yourself whether it is actually important or just emotionally loud. Something can feel overwhelming and still be temporary. Something can feel calm and still shape your entire future. The brain does not automatically know the difference. It needs help. When you pause before reacting, you give the rational part of the brain time to engage. You lower the volume just enough to ask a better question. Is this intense because it matters or because it touched a nerve? That question alone begins to retrain the system. Intensity is not the enemy. It is information. But it is incomplete information. When you stop letting emotional volume decide what deserves your focus, you regain choice. You start investing energy where it actually compounds, not where it just burns hot and fast. And that is when life begins to feel less reactive and more intentional, not because everything is quieter, but because you finally learned that loud does not always mean important. The "if it feels right, it must be right" mental trap. There is a moment that feels almost reassuring. A decision clicks into place and your body relaxes. The tension drops. You think this feels right. And just like that, the debate is over. No more questioning. No more weighing options. That feeling becomes the final stamp of approval. The problem is not that the feeling exists. The problem is how quickly the brain turns relief into truth. The "if it feels right, it must be right" trap works because feelings are fast. They are immediate. They arrive before doubt, before logic, before consequences. And the brain loves speed. When something feels right, what is often happening is that friction has disappeared. The internal conflict quiets down. That quiet feels like alignment, but it is often just the absence of resistance. Here is the shock most people never see coming. Feeling right does not mean something is good for you. It often means something matches your existing patterns. The brain rewards familiarity with relief. When a choice fits the story you already believe about yourself or the world, your nervous system settles. That settling feels like confirmation. Even if the choice leads you straight back into the same outcomes you said you wanted to avoid. Think about how many bad decisions felt right at the time. Texting the person you knew would complicate your life. Avoiding a difficult conversation because keeping the peace felt better. Saying yes when you meant no because the relief of approval washed over you. In those moments, the feeling of rightness did not come from wisdom. It came from short-term emotional regulation. The brain is constantly trying to reduce discomfort. When you face uncertainty, growth, or confrontation, discomfort rises. Choosing the easier option makes that discomfort disappear. The brain rewards that relief with a sense of rightness. It is not evaluating the long-term impact. It is celebrating the fact that the tension stopped. This is why the trap is so convincing. The feeling is real. The calm is real. The certainty feels earned. But what you are often feeling is not intuition. It is pattern reinforcement. The brain is saying yes because it recognizes the path, not because the destination is better. This is especially dangerous when emotions are involved. Attraction, nostalgia, validation. These feelings carry warmth and excitement, which the brain interprets as positive signals. If something feels good emotionally, the brain assumes it must be correct. It rarely asks whether the good feeling is coming from safety, growth, or simply dopamine and familiarity. There is also a memory bias at play. When a choice feels right, the brain selectively remembers moments that support it and downplays warning signs. Doubts get reframed as overthinking. Red flags get renamed chemistry. The feeling becomes the filter through which all information passes. Anything that threatens the feeling gets rejected. This is how people stay loyal to decisions long after the evidence says otherwise. Admitting it was wrong would bring discomfort back. So the brain defends the feeling instead. It doubles down, not because it is stubborn, but because it is trying to avoid emotional pain. The trap becomes even stronger if you were taught to distrust logic or external input. If you learned that following your feelings is the highest form of authenticity, then questioning them feels like betrayal. You start equating emotional certainty with integrity. If it feels right, acting on it feels honest. If it feels wrong, stopping feels like self-betrayal. But feelings are not moral compasses. They are internal weather patterns. What makes this trap so sticky is that feelings do contain information. They are not random. They tell you what matters to you, what you fear, what you desire. But they do not tell you what to do. When the brain skips the interpretation step and jumps straight from feeling to action, mistakes feel inevitable in hindsight. The shift happens when you separate comfort from correctness. Something can feel right because it avoids discomfort, not because it leads to alignment. Something can feel wrong because it challenges you, not because it is a mistake. Growth often feels wrong before it feels right, because it disrupts familiar emotional loops. This does not mean ignoring your feelings. It means slowing them down. When something feels right, ask what exactly feels right. Is it relief? Is it excitement? Is it validation? Those answers matter. They tell you what the feeling is solving, not whether the decision is sound. Over time, learning to pause breaks the trap. You stop outsourcing decisions to the loudest internal signal. You start noticing that real alignment has a different quality. It is quieter, less urgent. It holds up even when the initial emotional high fades. If you have ever looked back and thought, I do not know why that felt so right at the time, this is why. The brain mistook emotional comfort for correctness. And once you see that pattern, you stop asking, does this feel right? And start asking something far more powerful. What will this feel like after the feeling wears off? Why first impressions override all future evidence. Something strange happens in the first few seconds you meet someone or encounter an idea. Before you know anything real, before evidence shows up, a conclusion quietly forms. You feel it more than you think it, like a mental click. Trustworthy, sketchy, interesting, not for me. And once that click happens, your brain starts behaving as if the case is already closed. First impressions are powerful not because they are accurate, but because they arrive early. The brain is obsessed with efficiency. It hates leaving things unresolved. So the moment it gets a small amount of information, tone of voice, facial expression, energy in the room, it fills in the rest. That fill-in feels natural, almost invisible. You are not aware of deciding. You are just suddenly sure. Here is the part that should unsettle you. Once that first impression forms, your brain immediately switches roles. It stops being a neutral observer and becomes a lawyer. Its job is no longer to find the truth. Its job is to defend the initial conclusion. Every new piece of information is filtered through that lens. Evidence that agrees gets amplified. Evidence that disagrees gets minimized, explained away, or ignored entirely. This is called confirmation bias, but knowing the name does not weaken its grip. The reason it is so strong is emotional. First impressions create emotional coherence. The brain likes having a story that makes sense. Changing that story requires effort and uncertainty. It means admitting you were wrong. The brain experiences that as a threat to stability, even when the correction would benefit you. Think about how quickly you decide whether you like someone. That judgment often sticks long after the person has shown you different sides of themselves. If you initially liked them, you excuse their mistakes. You tell yourself they had a bad day. If you initially disliked them, even neutral behavior feels irritating. The same action means two completely different things, depending on the first impression. The brain does this because first impressions help it predict. Prediction equals control. Control equals safety. Once the brain thinks it knows what something is, it relaxes. It does not want to reopen the file. Reopening means admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty makes the nervous system uneasy. This bias does not just apply to people. It applies to opportunities, ideas, even versions of yourself. If you try something once and it feels awkward or you fail, your brain labels it as not for you. Later evidence that you could improve gets discounted. You already decided. If you are told early on that you are bad at something, that impression becomes sticky. Every struggle confirms it. Every success feels like a fluke. There is also a memory distortion at play. Once a first impression exists, your memory reorganizes itself around it. You remember the beginning more clearly than what came after. Early moments get replayed. Later contradictory moments fade. Over time, the story feels consistent, even if it was not. Your brain edits reality to protect the original judgment. This is why reputations are so hard to change. A single early narrative can outweigh years of behavior. The brain prefers a simple story over a complex update. And the earlier the story forms, the deeper it embeds. First impressions arrive before emotional defenses are up, which makes them feel especially real. What makes this dangerous is that first impressions often form under poor conditions. Stress, insecurity, limited information, a single snapshot, yet the brain treats that snapshot like a full documentary. Once the emotional tag is applied, good or bad, it shapes perception automatically. You are not consciously choosing to ignore evidence. You literally see it differently. This bias also explains why people struggle to see growth in others. If someone hurt you once, even unintentionally, your brain marks them as unsafe. Later consistency and repair may never fully register. Not because you are unforgiving, but because your nervous system learned a lesson early and does not want to unlearn it. And here is the part that turns the lens inward. You do this to yourself too. The first story you tell about who you are sticks. The shy one, the failure, the responsible one, the difficult one. Every future experience is filtered to support that identity. Evidence that challenges it feels uncomfortable and gets dismissed. Growth threatens the original impression, so the brain resists it. The way out is not forcing yourself to think differently. That rarely works. The shift starts with curiosity. When you notice yourself feeling certain very quickly, pause. Certainty that arrives instantly is often borrowed from the past, not built in the present. Ask what information you might be missing, not to invalidate your perception, but to widen it. First impressions are not useless. They are fast guesses. The mistake is treating them like verdicts. When you allow impressions to remain flexible, the brain slowly learns that updating is safe. It learns that being wrong is not dangerous. That learning takes repetition, not willpower. If you have ever wondered why evidence never seems to change certain beliefs, whether about people, situations, or yourself, this is why. The brain fell in love with its first answer. And love, especially early love, is hard to argue with. But the moment you see that pattern, first impressions lose their authority. They become what they always were, a starting point, not the truth. Emotional momentum. Why moods decide decisions before logic. Most decisions are already leaning in one direction before you ever think about them. You wake up in a certain mood, and suddenly everything looks different. The same choice that felt obvious yesterday now feels risky. The same conversation feels heavier. The same opportunity feels annoying or exciting for reasons you cannot fully explain. That is not coincidence. That is emotional momentum quietly steering the wheel. Emotions do not arrive in isolation. They carry motion. Once a mood takes hold, it builds speed, like a train already moving down the tracks. Logic does not start from zero. It jumps onto whatever is already moving. When you are calm, your thoughts tend to be balanced. When you are anxious, your thoughts lean toward caution and worst-case scenarios. When you are frustrated, your thoughts become sharp and reactive. The decision feels logical in the moment, but the direction was chosen earlier by the mood. Here is the part that usually goes unnoticed. The brain prefers consistency. Once an emotional state is active, the brain looks for thoughts and actions that match it, not because they are correct, but because they feel coherent. Coherence feels safe. So if you are in a low mood, the brain pulls up reasons to withdraw. If you are in an elevated mood, the brain pulls up reasons to say yes. Logic becomes a translator, not a leader. This is why people make decisions they later regret and honestly cannot explain why they felt so certain at the time. The certainty came from momentum. The mood created a direction, and the mind filled in justifications to keep things moving smoothly. Stopping to question would have required slowing down, and slowing down creates friction. The brain avoids that. Emotional momentum is especially powerful because it operates below awareness. You do not think I am anxious, so I should decide this way. You think this just makes sense. The feeling is already baked into the reasoning. By the time logic arrives, it is not evaluating options. It is defending a trajectory. Think about how arguments escalate. One irritated comment shifts the emotional tone. That irritation builds. Each response adds energy. Soon, decisions are being made that would never happen in a neutral state. Words are said, lines are crossed. In the moment, everything feels justified. Later, when the momentum dies down, clarity returns and the decisions feel foreign. The same thing happens with avoidance. A small sense of dread leads to delay. Delay increases anxiety. Anxiety increases avoidance. Eventually, the decision to not act feels completely reasonable. The brain says, "See how bad this feels." Avoiding must be the right choice. But the feeling did not come from the situation itself. It came from the emotional momentum that built over time. There is also a biological layer to this. Emotions change your brain chemistry. Stress hormones narrow focus. They push the brain toward short-term relief. Calm states allow broader thinking. Excited states increase risk tolerance. None of this is conscious. Your capacity to reason shifts with your emotional state, but the brain does not announce the change. It simply hands you thoughts that match the state you are in. This is why timing matters so much in decision-making. A decision made when you are depleted is a different decision than one made when you are regulated. But in the moment, both feel equally logical. Emotional momentum blurs that distinction. It convinces you that now is the right time, even when now is emotionally compromised. What makes this tricky is that emotional momentum can feel productive. Strong feelings create urgency. Urgency creates movement. Movement feels like progress, but movement without direction is not wisdom. It is just speed. The brain confuses decisiveness with clarity when emotions are driving. This is also why people stay consistent with decisions that no longer serve them. Once a direction is chosen, emotional momentum builds around it. Changing course would require emotional interruption. That interruption feels uncomfortable. Doubt creeps in. The brain resists and says, "Just keep going." Stopping feels worse than continuing, even if continuing is wrong. The shift happens when you learn to notice the emotional state before the decision, not the reasons. The state. Ask yourself what you are feeling and how long you have been feeling it. Strong emotions are not bad, but they are directional. If you do not name the direction, You will follow it by default. This does not mean waiting until you feel nothing. That is impossible. It means creating a pause long enough for momentum to slow. Even a short pause can change the decision entirely. When the emotional wave settles, logic finally gets a fair vote instead of acting as a spokesperson. If you have ever looked back and thought, "That did not even feel like me, this is why." It was you, but you were moving fast emotionally. Emotional momentum decided first. Logic simply caught up and made it sound reasonable. And once you see that pattern, you stop asking, "What should I do right now?" and start asking a quieter, but far more powerful question. Who is deciding this? The brain's shortcut that equates effort with value. There is a quiet assumption most people never question. If something takes a lot of effort, it must be worth more. If it hurts, it must matter. If you struggled for it, it must be valuable. That belief feels noble. It feels disciplined. It feels like character. But it is also one of the brain's most misleading shortcuts. This shortcut forms early. As kids, effort is praised. Hard work is rewarded. Struggle is framed as proof that you are doing something right. Over time, the brain starts linking effort with meaning. The harder something feels, the more important it seems. That connection settles deep, long before you have the ability to question it. Here is the shock. Effort does not equal value. Effort equals cost, and the brain often confuses cost with importance because it wants to justify what you have already invested. Once you pour time, energy, or pain into something, your brain becomes emotionally attached to the idea that it must be worth it. Otherwise, the discomfort would feel wasted. The brain hates waste. This is why people stay in situations long after they stop serving them. Relationships, careers, identities. You hear phrases like, "I have put too much into this to walk away now." That sentence is not logic. It is the brain protecting itself from regret. The more effort you invest, the harder it becomes to evaluate the thing itself honestly. The effort becomes the evidence. There is a psychological mechanism behind this. When the brain experiences prolonged effort or suffering, it looks for meaning to regulate the pain. Meaning reduces distress, so the brain assigns extra value to whatever caused the effort. If it did not do that, the pain would feel pointless. This is how people end up defending systems, beliefs, or roles that exhaust them. The effort itself becomes the justification. This shortcut shows up everywhere. People assume a complicated explanation must be smarter than a simple one, that a draining path must be more legitimate than an easeful one, that if something comes naturally, it cannot be serious. Ease feels suspicious because it contradicts the story that value is earned through struggle. The brain reinforces this through identity. When you work hard at something, you start seeing yourself as the kind of person who does hard things. Letting go threatens that identity. If the thing was not valuable, what does that say about all the effort you gave it? So the brain doubles down. It inflates the importance, not because it is true, but because it is emotionally safer. This is also why burnout often goes unnoticed until it is severe. The effort feels meaningful, so the exhaustion is reframed as sacrifice. You tell yourself it will be worth it later. The brain uses future payoff to justify present depletion. But value that consistently costs your well-being is not value. It is extraction. Another place this shortcut hides is in self-worth. Many people only feel valuable when they are trying hard. Rest feels undeserved. Ease feels lazy. Enjoyment feels earned only after suffering. The brain has learned that effort equals legitimacy. Without effort, worth feels unstable. So people overwork, overthink, and overgive, not because it is required, but because effort is how their brain recognizes value. What makes this even more deceptive is that effort can feel rewarding in the short term. Pushing through discomfort releases stress chemicals and dopamine tied to accomplishment. That rush reinforces the behavior. The brain learns that effort feels productive, even when it is misdirected. It becomes easy to confuse being busy with being aligned. This shortcut also distorts how people judge others. Someone who struggles visibly is seen as more committed. Someone who succeeds with less effort is seen as lucky or undeserving. The brain respects effort because it recognizes cost. But cost alone does not tell you whether something is actually meaningful or effective. The shift begins when you separate difficulty from importance. Something can be hard because it is wrong for you, not because it is valuable. Something can feel easy because it fits, not because it lacks depth. Growth does not always hurt. Sometimes it simplifies. Sometimes it removes friction instead of adding it. This does not mean avoiding effort. Effort is part of building anything meaningful. The difference is whether the effort is generative or draining. Generative effort expands you. Draining effort depletes you. The brain often struggles to tell the difference because both feel intense. But intensity is not the same as value. When you start questioning this shortcut, a strange thing happens. You stop glorifying struggle for its own sake. You begin asking better questions. Is this effort moving me forward or keeping me stuck? Is the value coming from the outcome or just from how hard it feels? Those questions feel uncomfortable at first because they threaten old justifications. If you have ever stayed too long, pushed too hard, or sacrificed too much because you believed the effort itself made it worthwhile, this is why. The brain was trying to protect you from the pain of reconsideration. But real value does not need excessive justification. It holds up even when effort decreases. The moment you stop equating effort with worth, you free up enormous energy. You start choosing paths that challenge you without consuming you. You allow ease where it belongs. And you realize something quietly radical. Some of the most valuable things in life do not demand that you suffer to deserve them. Why the mind protects old beliefs like personal identity. There is a moment when someone challenges a belief you have held for a long time, and your body reacts before your mind does. Your chest tightens, your jaw sets. You feel irritated or defensive even if the topic is not that serious. That reaction is not about being right. It is about protection. Your brain is responding as if something personal is under attack, because to it it is. Beliefs are not just ideas floating around in your head. Over time, they become stitched into your identity. They help answer the question of who you are and how the world works. Once a belief plays that role, the brain treats it like part of you. Challenging it feels less like a debate and more like a threat to your sense of self. This is where things get uncomfortable. The brain values consistency more than accuracy. Consistency feels stable. It reduces uncertainty. When a belief has been around long enough, it becomes a mental anchor. It organizes memories, decisions, and expectations. Pulling it out would mean reorganizing everything around it. That is a lot of work. So the brain protects the belief, even if it is outdated or harmful. Think about how people react when deeply held beliefs are questioned. Political views, religious ideas, beliefs about success, love, or identity. The reaction is rarely calm curiosity. It is defensiveness, dismissal, sometimes anger. That intensity is not because the belief is correct. It is because the belief is familiar and central. The brain is trying to preserve internal order. There is a biological reason for this. The brain is constantly trying to predict the world. Beliefs help it do that. They create mental shortcuts. If a belief has worked well enough to explain past experiences, the brain labels it as reliable. Updating it introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty increases stress. So the brain resists updates unless the evidence becomes overwhelming or unavoidable. This is why facts alone rarely change minds. Information that contradicts an old belief is experienced as destabilizing. The brain does not calmly weigh it. It looks for ways to neutralize it. You might question the source, downplay the importance, find exceptions. Anything to keep the core belief intact. This is not dishonesty, it is self-regulation. Old beliefs are also tied to emotional memory. They form during meaningful moments, often emotional ones. Pain, belonging, failure, love. When a belief helps you make sense of those moments, it gains emotional weight. Letting go of the belief would mean revisiting the emotion without the same explanation. That can feel overwhelming. So the brain clings to the belief as emotional armor. This is especially true for beliefs about yourself. Ideas like I am not good at this, or I am the responsible one, or I always get hurt. These beliefs create a stable self-image. Even if the image is limiting, it is predictable. Predictability feels safer than possibility. Changing a self-belief means stepping into uncertainty about who you are. The brain interprets that as a loss of control. There is also a social layer. Beliefs connect you to groups, family, culture, community. Letting go of a belief can feel like risking belonging. The brain is deeply wired to protect social bonds. If a belief is shared by people you care about, questioning it can feel like rejection or betrayal. So the brain defends the belief to protect connection, not truth. What makes this protection so convincing is that it feels rational. The brain supplies reasons, explanations, counterarguments. But underneath the logic is a simpler motive. Keep things familiar, keep the self intact. Avoid emotional disruption. This is why growth often feels like grief. Letting go of an old belief means letting go of a version of yourself. Even if that version was limiting, it was known. The brain mourns that loss. It would rather defend the belief than face the discomfort of change. The shift does not happen by attacking beliefs head-on. That only strengthens the defense. The brain tightens its grip when it feels threatened. Change happens when safety is introduced. When curiosity replaces judgment. When the brain realizes that updating a belief does not mean losing yourself. It means refining the map. Beliefs are meant to evolve. They are tools, not identities. But the brain forgets that once they have been in place long enough, it treats them like organs instead of opinions. Seeing this changes how you relate to your own resistance. You stop asking, "Why am I so stubborn?" and start asking, "What is this belief protecting?" If you have ever felt a strong emotional reaction to being challenged, this is why. Your brain was not defending an idea, it was defending you. And once you understand that, you can approach change with more compassion and less force. Because identities do not shatter when beliefs update, they expand. And the brain can learn that expansion is not a threat, but a form of survival too. The emotional weight of loss compared to gain. There is a strange imbalance in how life hits you. You can gain something meaningful and feel good for a moment, but lose something of equal value, and it can sit in your chest for years. One compliment barely registers. One criticism replays endlessly. One success feels fleeting. One loss feels permanent. That imbalance is not you being dramatic. It is how your brain is wired. Loss lands heavier than gain because the brain experiences loss as a threat, not just an event. From an evolutionary standpoint, losing resources meant danger, less food, less shelter, less protection. So the brain learned to treat loss as urgent and serious. Gain, on the other hand, was optional, helpful, but not necessary for immediate survival. That wiring still runs in the background today, even when the loss is emotional rather than physical. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The brain does not measure value objectively. It measures impact emotionally, and loss creates a sharper emotional signal than gain. When you lose something, your nervous system activates, stress chemicals release, your focus narrows, your body prepares to protect what remains. That intensity brands the experience into memory. Gain rarely produces the same level of activation, so it fades faster. This is why losing one opportunity can overshadow 10 that went well. Why the end of a relationship can eclipse years of good moments. Why rejection hurts more than acceptance heals. The brain is not being unfair. It is being protective. It assumes that what was lost might be needed again, so it keeps the pain close as a reminder. The shock is how much this bias shapes your decisions without you noticing. Because loss feels heavier, you start organizing your life around avoiding it. You stay in situations that drain you because leaving would feel like losing something familiar. You avoid risks not because the gain is small, but because the potential loss feels unbearable. The brain whispers better to keep what you have than to risk feeling that pain again. There is a psychological mechanism behind this. The brain reacts more strongly to negative change than positive change of the same size. Losing $50 hurts more than gaining $50 feels good. Not because money is emotional, but because loss triggers fear and fear demands attention. Gain does not carry the same urgency, so the brain weights loss more heavily in its calculations. This creates a subtle distortion. You begin to believe that what you lost was more valuable than it actually was, simply because losing it hurt so much. Pain inflates perceived value. The brain assumes if it hurts this much, it must have mattered deeply. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it is just intensity masquerading as importance. This is why people idealize what they lost. An old relationship starts to look perfect in hindsight. A missed opportunity becomes the one that would have changed everything. The brain edits the memory to match the pain. It highlights the good and minimizes the problems because doing so makes the loss feel justified. If it was not that great, why would it hurt this much? So the brain rewrites the story. Loss also carries finality. Gain feels additive. You can always gain more. Loss feels subtractive. Something is gone. That sense of permanence hits the nervous system hard. Even when something is replaceable, the brain reacts as if it is not. It focuses on what is missing rather than what remains. That focus amplifies the emotional weight. This bias affects how you see yourself too. Failures stick more than successes. One mistake can redefine your self-image, while many wins barely move it. The brain treats failure as a loss of status, safety, or belonging. Those losses feel existential, so they linger. You tell yourself stories based on what went wrong rather than what went right, because the pain taught your brain to pay attention. Here is where it becomes personal. If you feel like losses define you more than gains, that does not mean you are negative. It means your brain learned to prioritize protection over celebration. It remembers what hurt so it can try to prevent it from happening again. The problem is that this can shrink your life. When avoiding loss becomes the main strategy, growth slows. Risk feels irresponsible. Change feels dangerous. The brain rarely accounts for the hidden cost of not gaining. It feels neutral, but it is not. Missed joy, missed connection, missed potential. Those do not trigger alarms, so they go unnoticed. But over time, the absence of gain can be just as impactful as loss, even if it does not hurt in the same sharp way. The shift begins when you realize that pain is not a perfect measure of value. Something can hurt deeply and still not deserve a permanent place in your identity. Something can feel good briefly and still be life-changing over time. The brain exaggerates loss to keep you safe, but safety is not the same as fulfillment. When you start noticing how much weight you give to what was taken compared to what was added, you regain balance. You stop letting loss dominate the narrative. You honor it without letting it define you, and slowly, the brain learns something new. That survival is not just about avoiding loss. It is also about allowing gain to matter. How the brain mistakes familiar stress for stability. There is a kind of stress that feels oddly normal. It is not dramatic or explosive. It hums in the background of your life. Tight shoulders, shallow breathing, a constant sense of being slightly behind. You wake up with it. You fall asleep with it. And after a while, you stop noticing it. That is when the brain makes its mistake. It stops labeling the stress as stress and starts calling it stability. The brain is not designed to seek peace. It is designed to seek predictability. Whatever repeats becomes the baseline. So, when stress shows up consistently, Day after day, the nervous system adjusts. It recalibrates what normal feels like. The tension becomes familiar. Familiar becomes safe. And safe gets mislabeled as stable. This is why people can live in chronically stressful environments and still say they are fine. A demanding job, a volatile relationship, financial pressure that never fully eases. The stress is real, but it is expected, and expectation lowers alarm. The brain thinks I know this terrain. I know how to survive here. That survival skill gets mistaken for well-being. Here is the shock. The absence of crisis is not the same as the presence of health. Familiar stress does not feel dangerous because it has not killed you yet. That is literally the brain's logic. If it keeps happening and you are still standing, it must be manageable. So the brain conserves energy by not treating it as a problem. It would rather adapt than question the environment. This adaptation comes at a cost. The nervous system stays activated. Stress hormones remain slightly elevated. Your body never fully resets. But because the stress is consistent, it stops feeling urgent. It feels like life calm. On the other hand, can feel unsettling. When stress drops, the brain does not celebrate. It scans for what is missing. It asks why things feel quiet. Quiet feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar triggers caution. This is why rest can feel uncomfortable, why boredom can feel threatening, why peace can feel empty instead of nourishing. The brain learned that stress equals engagement, movement, purpose. Without it, something feels off. So people unconsciously recreate stress just to feel normal again. They overcommit. They procrastinate until urgency returns. They stay connected to drama because it provides a familiar emotional rhythm. The brain is not addicted to stress itself. It is attached to the predictability of it. Stress has rules. You know how you respond. You know what it costs. Unknown calm does not come with instructions. It forces the brain to update its map, and updating requires effort and vulnerability. So the brain resists. This confusion is especially strong if stress was present early in life. If chaos, pressure, or emotional tension were part of your formative environment, your nervous system learned to regulate within that context. Stress became the reference point. Later, when things are calm, your body does not interpret it as safety. It interprets it as unfamiliar. You might feel restless, disconnected, on edge for no clear reason, so you return to what you know. Not consciously, but instinctively. The familiar stress feels grounding. It gives you something to manage, something to focus on. The brain says, at least I understand this. At least I know who I am here. That sense of identity is powerful. Stress becomes part of how you define yourself. The responsible one, the busy one, the strong one who handles pressure. Letting go of familiar stress can feel like losing structure. Who are you without the constant tension? What fills the space? The brain fears that question more than it fears the stress, so it protects the pattern. It calls it stability. It convinces you that this is just how life is. The illusion deepens because familiar stress often brings short-term rewards. Productivity, praise, a sense of importance. When you are always managing something, you feel needed. When the stress disappears, those signals disappear too. The brain interprets that loss of stimulation as a problem, not as relief. What the brain misses is the long-term damage. Chronic stress narrows perspective. It reduces creativity. It dulls joy. But because these changes happen slowly, they do not trigger alarms. The brain adapts and keeps going. Stability becomes a low-level survival mode, not a state of thriving. The shift begins when you notice how your body responds to calm. If peace feels uncomfortable, That is not a sign that something is wrong with peace. It is a sign that your nervous system has been trained in stress. That training can change, but it takes patience. The brain needs repeated experiences of calm without consequences to update its definition of safety. This does not mean your life will suddenly feel effortless. It means stress stops being the anchor. You learn to tolerate quiet without filling it. You learn to rest without guilt. At first, that feels disorienting. But over time, the body softens. The baseline shifts. If you have ever wondered why you feel most like yourself when you are under pressure, this is why. Your brain confused familiarity with stability. It chose what it knew over what might actually support you. And once you see that pattern, you stop asking why you cannot relax and start asking a better question. What would stability feel like if it did not require constant stress to exist? Why negative memories feel more reliable than positive ones? There is a reason your mind jumps to what went wrong before it remembers what went right. You can have 100 decent days, but one bad moment sticks like glue. It replays. It feels solid, trustworthy. Meanwhile, the good moments blur together, almost like they happened to someone else. That difference is not about accuracy. It is about how the brain decides what is worth keeping close. Negative memories feel more reliable because they arrive with urgency. When something hurts, scares you, or embarrasses you, your body reacts immediately. Your heart rate changes. Your muscles tense. Your attention locks in. That physical response tells the brain this matters. The brain then marks the memory as important for survival. It stores it with extra detail so you can avoid repeating it. Positive experiences rarely trigger the same level of activation. They feel pleasant, but not urgent. There is no threat to learn from, no danger to map, so the brain stores them lightly. It assumes you can find them again if needed. The negative memory, however, feels like a warning, and warnings get priority. This is not pessimism. It is protection. The brain evolved in environments where one mistake could cost your life. Remembering danger mattered more than savoring comfort. That ancient logic still runs today, even when the danger is social or emotional rather than physical. A rejection feels more instructive than acceptance. A failure feels more informative than success. The shock is how convincing this feels. Because negative memories are vivid, the brain treats them as more truthful. You think if it stuck this hard, it must mean something. Pain becomes evidence. The memory feels sharp, detailed, and emotionally charged. Positive memories, by comparison, feel soft, vague, easy to question. So when your mind looks for guidance, it trusts what feels clearer, not what is actually more representative. This is why one criticism can outweigh 10 compliments. The criticism triggers a threat response. Your brain asks, what does this say about me? How do I prevent this next time? The compliment does not demand the same analysis. It does not feel urgent, so it fades. Later, when you evaluate yourself, the negative memory feels more reliable simply because it was stored with more intensity. There is also a repetition effect. Negative memories get replayed more often because the brain keeps checking them for lessons. Each replay strengthens the neural pathway. The memory becomes easier to access. The easier it is to access, the more true it feels. Positive memories get less rehearsal, so they feel distant even if they happened recently. This bias shapes identity in quiet ways. If you remember failures more clearly than successes, you start to believe you fail more often. If you remember rejection more vividly than connection, you start to believe you are unwanted. The brain does not count experiences evenly. It weighs them emotionally. Negative weight tips the scale. Memory itself is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. Each time you recall a negative memory, you are not just remembering it. You are re-experiencing it. The emotion comes back. The body responds again. That reactivation tells the brain this is still relevant. Keep it accessible. Positive memories often do not get the same emotional reactivation, so the brain assumes they are less important. There is also a trust issue. Positive memories can feel suspicious. They can feel like exceptions. The brain asks, was that real or was I just lucky? Negative memories feel consistent. They match fears. They align with caution. The brain trusts consistency more than pleasure, so it leans on what confirms its protective stance. This becomes especially powerful if you experienced stress or criticism early in life. The brain learned that negative feedback mattered. It helped you adjust. It helped you belong. Later, even when the environment changes, the brain keeps prioritizing negative input. It treats it as more reliable because it once was. The cost is subtle but heavy. When negative memories dominate, you start making decisions to avoid pain rather than pursue fulfillment. You remember what went wrong last time and hesitate. The brain says, see, this is what happens. That memory feels like proof, even if it represents a small part of the full picture. The brain rarely does the math on what you gained because gain does not feel instructive. It feels optional, so it gets underweighted. Over time, your internal story skews toward caution. You become risk-averse. Not because the world is dangerous, but because your memory system is biased toward warning. The shift begins when you realize that reliability is not the same as intensity. A memory can feel clear because it was painful, not because it was more accurate. When you notice your mind reaching for negative evidence, first pause. Ask what else happened. Ask what you are not remembering with the same clarity. This does not mean forcing positivity. It means balancing the record. When you intentionally revisit positive experiences and let yourself feel them again, the brain starts updating. It learns that good moments are also worth storing deeply. That safety does not always come from avoidance. Sometimes it comes from remembering that not everything hurt. If you have ever wondered why your mind trusts the painful memories more than the joyful ones, this is why. Your brain was trying to keep you safe, not fair. And once you see that pattern, you stop assuming that what feels most real is the whole truth. You start giving equal weight to what supported you, not just what scarred you. The illusion of control created by emotional reactions. There is a strange sense of power that comes with reacting. When something upsets you and you respond immediately, it feels like you are doing something. You feel engaged, alert, in charge. Whether it is anger, defensiveness, over-explaining, or shutting down, the reaction creates the feeling that you took control of the situation. But most of the time, that feeling is an illusion. Emotional reactions feel active, but they are usually automatic. They happen fast, before reflection has a chance to show up. The body tightens, the voice changes. The mind locks onto a story. In that moment, the brain interprets action as control. Something happened, you reacted, therefore you handled it. That conclusion feels comforting, especially in situations where you actually felt threatened or powerless. Here is the shock. Emotional reactions are often signs that control has already been lost. The nervous system has taken over. Survival circuits are driving behavior. The reaction is not a choice. It is a reflex. But because something happened outwardly, the brain rewrites the story and says you are in charge. The brain hates helplessness. Feeling out of control is deeply uncomfortable. So when an emotional reaction fires, the brain reframes it as agency. Anger becomes strength. Withdrawal becomes self-protection. Overreacting becomes caring deeply. These labels restore a sense of control, even if the reaction made the situation worse. This illusion is especially powerful because reactions change the emotional landscape immediately. Yelling releases tension. Avoidance reduces anxiety. Defensiveness creates distance from shame. The brain experiences that emotional shift and says it worked. Relief equals success. But relief is not the same as resolution. It is just the nervous system calming itself down. Think about arguments. Reacting strongly can feel like standing your ground. You feel powerful in the moment. But afterward, things are often messier. Misunderstandings deepen. Regret shows up. Yet the brain remembers the moment of emotional release more than the long-term outcome. It remembers feeling in control, not whether you actually were. This is how the illusion sustains itself. Emotional reactions give immediate feedback. They make you feel alive and engaged. Pausing, on the other hand, feels passive. It feels like doing nothing. The brain equates stillness with vulnerability, so it chooses reaction because reaction feels safer than waiting. There is also a predictability element. If you react the same way every time, the brain knows what to expect. That predictability feels like control. Even if the outcome is negative, it is familiar. The brain would rather choose a known emotional pattern than risk an unknown one. So it keeps reacting and keeps calling it management. This shows up clearly in people who pride themselves on being emotionally honest. They say things like, "I just say what I feel," or "I do not hold things in." That can sound healthy, but often it is unfiltered reaction being mistaken for authenticity. Authenticity involves awareness. Reaction skips that step. It dumps emotion outward and calls it truth. The illusion deepens when reactions shape others' behavior. If people back off when you get angry, the brain learns that anger creates space. That feels like control. If people reassure you when you panic, the brain learns that panic gets comfort. That feels like influence. But what is really happening is conditioning, not control. The reaction trains the environment, and the brain mistakes that for mastery. Over time, emotional reactions become identity. I am fairy. I am sensitive. I am intense. Those labels protect the pattern. They turn reflex into personality. Questioning the reaction then feels like questioning the self. The brain defends it harder because giving it up. How the brain uses fear as a fast decision tool. The fear does not wait for permission. It shows up fast, loud, and convincing. Before you have time to think, your body reacts. Your stomach tightens, your breathing shifts, and suddenly a decision feels obvious. Do not do it. Get out. Avoid this. That speed is not an accident. Fear is one of the brain's fastest tools for deciding, and it rarely explains itself. The brain uses fear because fear is efficient. It cuts through complexity. It turns a messy situation into a simple command: stop, retreat, protect. In moments where danger is real, this speed saves lives. But in modern life, fear often fires in situations that are not actually threatening. The brain still treats it the same way. Fast feeling, fast conclusion. Here is the shock most people miss. When fear appears, the brain does not ask whether it is accurate. It asks whether it is useful. Fear narrows attention and reduces options, which makes decisions easier. Instead of weighing pros and cons, the brain lets fear choose. It feels decisive. It feels responsible. It feels like listening to your gut. But what you are often listening to is an alarm system designed for emergencies, not nuance. Fear feels authoritative because it comes with physical sensation. Your body reacts before your thoughts do. That reaction convinces you that something serious is happening. The brain interprets bodily intensity as evidence. If the body is this activated, there must be a reason. So the decision gets made quickly, and logic is recruited afterward to justify it. This is why fear-based decisions feel so certain in the moment. You are not debating. You are responding. The brain frames the response as wisdom because hesitation feels dangerous. Even when the fear is about emotional exposure rather than physical harm, the brain uses the same shortcut. It treats discomfort like danger. Think about how often fear stops you before you even try. Speaking up, changing direction, leaving something familiar. The fear arrives and says this is risky. That message feels responsible. But often, the fear is not about the outcome. It is about uncertainty. The brain hates uncertainty because it cannot predict it. Fear steps in to close the loop quickly. There is a memory component here. Fear is tied to past experiences. If something once led to pain, embarrassment, or loss, the brain stores that association. Later, when a similar situation appears, fear activates instantly. It does not check whether the context has changed. It assumes the old lesson still applies. The faster the fear arrives, the more reliable it feels. This is why fear is such a powerful decision maker. It feels experienced, seasoned, like it knows something you do not. But what it often knows is the past, not the present. The brain reuses old data to make fast calls, even when the data is outdated. Fear also reduces responsibility. When fear decides, you feel less accountable. You tell yourself I had no choice or it was too risky. The brain likes that. Fear provides an external authority. You did not avoid the opportunity. Fear told you to. That relieves pressure and preserves self-image. This shortcut becomes a problem when fear is used for everyday decisions. The brain starts defaulting to it because it works quickly. Over time, fear becomes the gatekeeper. If fear shows up, the answer is no. That feels safe, predictable, but it also shrinks your range of action. You stop asking what you want and start asking what you can tolerate. The brain reinforces this because fear avoidance often brings immediate relief. When you listen to fear and back away, the anxiety drops. The nervous system calms. The brain marks that as success. It learns that fear led to safety. So it uses fear again next time. The loop tightens. What the brain does not measure is the cost of that pattern. Missed growth, missed connection, missed competence. Those losses do not trigger alarms, so they are invisible. Fear only tracks what you avoided, not what you gave up. This is why fear can feel like intuition. Both are fast. Both are bodily, but intuition has a different quality. It is quieter. It does not spike panic. It does not demand immediate action. Fear rushes you. It says now or never. That urgency is the giveaway. The shift begins when you slow fear down. not by fighting it, but by questioning its timing. Ask what fear is responding to. Is it a real threat or an unfamiliar feeling? Is it danger or exposure? Fear is very bad at telling those apart. When you pause, even briefly, you interrupt the shortcut. The brain has to engage other systems. Perspective returns, options widen. The fear does not disappear, but it loses its authority to decide on its own. This does not mean ignoring fear. Emotional anchoring. Why the first feeling sets the standard. Sometimes the very first feeling you have about something becomes the ruler you measure everything else against. You walk into a room and feel awkward. You meet someone and feel uneasy. You start a project and feel overwhelmed. That initial feeling settles in fast, and without realizing it, your brain treats it like a reference point. Everything that follows gets compared to that first emotional hit, even if it no longer makes sense. This happens because the brain is desperate for orientation. When you enter a new situation, there is uncertainty. The brain does not like floating without context, so it grabs the first emotional signal it can find and says, "This is how this situation feels." That first feeling becomes an anchor, not because it is accurate, but because it arrived first. Here is the shock. The first feeling is often the least informed. It shows up before you understand what is happening, before you have data, before patterns emerge. But the brain does not wait. It uses the feeling to create a baseline, then starts adjusting everything around it. Later experiences do not get evaluated on their own terms. They get judged based on whether they confirm or challenge that original emotion. If the first feeling was anxiety, neutral moments feel tense. Positive moments feel temporary or suspicious. If the first feeling was excitement, warning signs feel small. Red flags get softened. The anchor quietly shapes perception. You think you are responding to reality, but you are responding to contrast with the first emotion. The brain does this because anchors reduce cognitive load. Once there is a standard, the brain does not have to constantly reassess. It can simply ask, does this match what I already decided this feels like? That shortcut saves energy, but it also locks you into early impressions that may no longer be relevant. This is why first days matter so much. First dates, first jobs, first attempts. If the beginning feels painful or embarrassing, the brain tags the entire experience with that emotional tone. Even when things improve, the improvement feels fragile. You keep waiting for the original feeling to come back, because that is what the brain learned to expect. Emotional anchoring also explains why people struggle to revise their opinions. The first feeling becomes emotionally sticky. It feels reliable because it has history. The longer it stays in place, the more the brain trusts it. New information has to work harder to shift the anchor. It is not just competing with facts. It is competing with familiarity. This is especially powerful when the first feeling is intense. Intensity signals importance to the brain. A strong early emotion leaves a deeper imprint. The brain assumes that something that felt that strong must be significant. So it keeps returning to it, even if the intensity was caused by stress, novelty, or insecurity rather than the situation itself. Think about how this plays out in relationships. If the first phase is chaotic or emotionally charged, calm later on can feel wrong, boring, empty. The anchor was intensity, so stability feels like loss. Or if the beginning was cold or distant, later warmth might feel untrustworthy. The brain keeps checking against the original emotional standard. This also happens internally. If your first experience trying something left you feeling incompetent, that feeling anchors your self-perception. Even as you gain skill, the brain keeps referencing the initial discomfort. Success feels surprising, like an exception. The anchor stays negative until something forces a reset. The brain uses anchoring because it prefers continuity. Changing an emotional standard means admitting that the original feeling was incomplete. That creates uncertainty. So the brain holds on. It would rather be consistent than accurate. Consistency feels safer. What makes this illusion convincing is that the anchor often operates silently. You do not think I am judging this based on my first feeling. You think this just feels off, or this is not for me. The judgment feels immediate and intuitive. But intuition shaped by anchoring is often just the past speaking loudly in the present. Why the brain assumes emotional patterns will repeat forever. At some point, your brain quietly decided this is just how things go. When something hurts the same way a few times, the mind starts drawing a straight line into the future. It says this always happens. This is how it ends. This is who I am in situations like this. And without realizing it, you stop experiencing the present and start reliving a pattern. The brain is obsessed with prediction. Its main job is not happiness or truth. It is anticipation. If it can guess what comes next, it feels safer. Emotional patterns are especially tempting because they seem consistent. If rejection followed effort before, the brain assumes effort leads to rejection. If anxiety showed up every time you tried something new, the brain assumes new equals anxiety. Pattern recognized, case closed. Here is the unsettling part. The brain does not need many data points to make this call. A few emotionally intense experiences are enough. Intensity tells the brain this is important. Repetition tells it this is reliable. Once those two combine, the brain stops checking for updates. It treats the emotional pattern like a law of nature rather than a temporary response. This is why emotional pain feels permanent while joy feels fragile. Pain repeats with similar sensations: tight chest, heavy stomach, spinning thoughts. The brain recognizes the feeling and says, I know this one. It assumes the outcome will match previous times, even if the situation is different. Emotional familiarity gets mistaken for inevitability. The shock is that the brain does not actually believe the pattern will repeat forever. It just acts like it will. Acting as if something is permanent feels safer than admitting uncertainty. If the brain assumes the pain is coming anyway, it can brace for it. Hope requires openness. Openness feels risky. There is also a control illusion here. Predicting a negative emotional outcome feels like preparation. The brain says, at least I will not be surprised. That anticipation feels responsible, mature, realistic. But what it often is fear dressed up as foresight. The brain would rather expect pain than risk being caught off guard by it. This assumption hardens quickly when patterns tie into identity. If you felt ignored enough times, the brain stops seeing individual moments and starts seeing a trait. I am someone people overlook. If you felt overwhelmed often, it becomes I am just an anxious person. The pattern moves from experience to self-definition. Once that happens, the brain defends it fiercely. Why? Because changing the pattern would mean rewriting the story of who you are. That creates instability. The brain prefers a painful certainty over a hopeful unknown. At least the pattern is familiar. At least it makes sense of the past. Memory plays a role here too. Emotional patterns feel continuous because the brain remembers them as a single thread rather than separate events. It compresses time. 10 moments of sadness across years blur into one story of sadness. Improvement does not stand out unless it is dramatic. Gradual change goes unnoticed. This is why people often say things like "I always end up here" or "it never works out." Those statements feel factual, but they are emotional summaries. The brain collapses complexity into a simple rule. That rule becomes a shortcut for decision making. Why try if I know how this goes? The danger is that this assumption changes behavior. If you expect the emotional pattern to repeat, you act in ways that make it more likely. You hold back. You tense up. You interpret neutral cues as confirmation. The brain then says, "See, I was right." The pattern reinforces itself not because it is inevitable, but because expectation shaped experience. The brain also ignores context. It does not easily factor in growth, skill, support, or changed circumstances. It compares emotional sensations, not conditions. If the feeling matches, the conclusion follows. This is why even positive changes can feel emotionally flat at first. The pattern expectation is still running. Breaking this assumption does not happen through positive thinking. The brain does not update from reassurance. It updates from evidence, specifically from repeated emotional experiences that contradict the pattern while still feeling safe. One good moment is dismissed as an exception. Many good moments slowly force revision. The first step is noticing when your mind speaks in forever language. Always, never, every time. Those words signal pattern assumption, not truth. When you catch that, you create a crack in the certainty. You remind the brain that it is predicting, not reporting. Then comes patience. Emotional patterns do not dissolve instantly because the brain built them over time. It needs time to unlearn them. Each new experience that does not follow the old script matters, even if it feels small, especially if it feels small. If you have ever felt trapped by the sense that things will always feel this way, this is why. The brain confused repetition with destiny. It used the past to lock down the future. And once you understand that, the pattern loses some of its authority. You stop asking, "Is this how it always goes?" and start asking, "Is this how it went before?" That difference is where change begins. The shortcut that makes silence feel like rejection. Silence hits harder than words ever could. A message left unread. A pause after you speak. Someone not responding the way you expected. Your chest tightens and the meaning appears instantly. They are pulling away. You did something wrong. You are being rejected. That conclusion feels immediate and obvious, even when there is no real evidence. That is not intuition. It is a shortcut. The brain is deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity. Silence is ambiguous. It offers no clear signal, no explanation, no emotional data to work with. So the brain fills the gap fast. It reaches for the most emotionally charged interpretation available. Rejection. Because rejection hurts, and hurt feels important. Important feels true. Here is the shock. Silence itself carries no emotional meaning. It is neutral. But the brain treats neutral information as a threat because it cannot predict what comes next. When the brain cannot predict, it assumes danger. Silence becomes a blank screen onto which your fears get projected. This shortcut develops early. As social creatures, we are wired to monitor connection. In early life, responsiveness equals safety. When attention disappears, the nervous system reacts. That reaction gets stored. Later, when silence appears in adult relationships, the same circuitry lights up. The brain does not ask whether the situation is actually unsafe. It recognizes the pattern and reacts. The reaction is fast because the brain believes speed equals protection. If silence might mean rejection, it is better to assume it does and prepare. Preparing might mean pulling back first, over-explaining, apologizing preemptively, or emotionally shutting down. All of those feel like taking control. The brain prefers that over waiting. Silence feels especially threatening because it removes feedback. When someone is upset, at least you know where you stand. When someone is quiet, you are left guessing. Guessing creates vulnerability. The brain hates vulnerability, so it collapses uncertainty into a familiar pain. Rejection is painful, but it is understandable. It gives the brain a story. Memory strengthens this shortcut. If silence once preceded loss or abandonment, the brain links the two. Later, even harmless pauses trigger the same emotional response. The brain does not check context. It checks similarity. Silence feels like silence, so the conclusion follows. This is why text messages are such powerful triggers. There is no tone, no facial expression, just absence. The brain rushes in to interpret. If the response is delayed, the mind starts constructing reasons. They are annoyed. They lost interest. They are done. Each thought adds emotional weight, making the assumption feel more real. The shortcut also feeds on self-focus. In silence, the only available data is you. So the brain turns inward. What did I do? What did I say? What does this say about me? Silence becomes a mirror that reflects insecurity, not reality. What makes this illusion convincing is emotional consistency. The feeling that arises in silence often matches old feelings of rejection. That familiarity tricks the brain into believing the cause must be the same. If it feels like rejection, it must be rejection. The brain trusts emotional patterns more than external evidence. The problem is that silence has countless explanations: distraction, fatigue, overwhelm, thoughtfulness. None of those trigger alarms, so the brain ignores them. It chooses the explanation that matches the emotional reaction already happening. The feeling comes first. The meaning gets assigned second. This shortcut reshapes behavior. If you believe silence means rejection, you might chase reassurance or withdraw completely. Both responses change the dynamic. Chasing can create pressure. Withdrawing can create distance. The brain then reads the resulting shift as confirmation. See, I knew it. The belief reinforces itself. Over time, this can make connection feel fragile. You start monitoring gaps, pauses, delays. The brain stays on alert, scanning for silence as a threat. Relationships begin to feel stressful, not because they are unsafe, but because the shortcut keeps misfiring. The deeper layer is control. Assuming rejection gives the brain a sense of preparedness. If you expect it, you cannot be blindsided. Hope feels riskier than pessimism, so the brain chooses the interpretation that reduces surprise, even if it increases pain. Breaking this shortcut starts with separating feeling from fact. Feeling rejected does not mean being rejected. The feeling is real. The conclusion: how emotional labels shape reality instantly. The moment you name a feeling, reality snaps into place around it. You say, I am anxious, and suddenly everything feels threatening. You say, I am bored, and the world loses color. You say, I am angry, and every detail sharpens into proof. That label does not just describe what you feel. It organizes what you see. The brain loves labels because labels reduce chaos. Emotions are messy sensations in the body: tightness, heat, pressure, restlessness. When the brain assigns a word to that sensation, it gains clarity, or at least the illusion of clarity. Once a label is chosen, The brain starts filtering reality through it. The feeling becomes a lens. Here is the shock. Emotional labels do not wait for understanding. They arrive early, often before you know what you are reacting to. The body sends a signal. The brain guesses a name. And once that name is attached, it feels obvious. Of course, this is anxiety. Of course, this is anger. The label feels accurate because it explains the sensation. But accuracy is not the same as completeness. When you label an emotion, the brain immediately starts building a story that matches it. If the label is sadness, memories of loss surface. If the label is frustration, obstacles stand out. The brain is not checking whether those details caused the feeling. It is gathering evidence to support the label it already chose. Cause and effect get reversed. This happens because labels create expectations. If you believe you are anxious, you expect danger. If you believe you are confident, you expect success. The brain scans the environment for confirmation. Neutral information gets interpreted through that expectation. A neutral comment feels critical. A quiet room feels heavy. The label quietly edits reality. The brain prefers this because it creates emotional certainty. Unlabeled sensations feel vague and uncomfortable. The brain wants to know what is happening, so it grabs the closest label from past experience. That label brings familiarity. Familiarity feels safe. Even if the label is negative, at least it makes sense. This is why emotional labels are so sticky. Once applied, they are hard to shake. The brain treats them like facts. You do not think I feel something like anxiety. You think I am anxious. The label becomes identity in that moment, and identity shapes perception more than circumstances ever could. There is also a social layer. Emotional labels come with scripts. If you are angry, anger behavior feels justified. If you are hurt, withdrawal feels appropriate. The label tells you how to act. Acting in line with the label reinforces it. The brain says, see, this fits. The loop tightens. The problem is that many emotional sensations overlap. Excitement and anxiety share similar bodily signals. Fatigue and sadness feel alike. Stress and anticipation can blur together. The label you choose determines the meaning you assign. Two people can feel the same sensation and live in completely different emotional realities because they named it differently. The brain does not slow down to consider alternative labels. Speed matters more than precision. The faster you name the feeling, the faster the brain can move on. That speed feels efficient, but it also locks you into a narrow interpretation. This is especially powerful during emotionally charged moments. In conflict, labeling yourself as disrespected instantly turns the other person into a threat. In uncertainty, labeling yourself as overwhelmed makes everything feel heavier. The label is not just internal. It shapes how you interpret others' intentions. Memory plays a role too. Once a moment is labeled emotionally, it gets stored that way. Later, when you recall it, the label comes back first. The memory feels consistent because the emotion has a name. Over time, repeated labels create patterns. I am always anxious here. I always feel ignored. The label moves from momentary to permanent. What makes this illusion convincing is relief. Naming a feeling can feel grounding. It gives structure. The brain experiences that relief and assumes the label was correct. But relief only means uncertainty dropped, not that truth was found. The shift is not about avoiding labels altogether. Labels can be useful. They help communicate. They help reflect. The problem is treating them as conclusions instead of hypotheses. When you say, I am anxious, you close the case. When you say something feels intense and I am not sure why, you keep the system open. Creating space between sensation and label changes everything. Instead of naming the emotion immediately, notice the raw experience. Tight chest, fast thoughts, low energy. That slows the brain down. It prevents the automatic story from taking over. Why the brain believes emotional stories over statistics. Statistics are quiet. Emotional stories are loud. One number can describe a trend affecting millions, but a single vivid story can hijack your attention and feel more real than all the data combined. You might know, logically, that something is rare or unlikely, yet one emotional example makes it feel common and urgent. That is not a flaw in intelligence. It is how the brain decides what matters. The brain evolved to learn through stories, not spreadsheets. Long before charts or averages existed, survival depended on remembering specific events. Who betrayed you? Where danger appeared? Which choice led to pain? Stories carried context, emotion, and consequence. Numbers do not. So when the brain has to choose what to trust, it leans toward what feels alive. Here is the shock. The brain does not evaluate truth based on accuracy first. It evaluates based on emotional signal strength. A story with a face, a name, and a feeling activates empathy, imagination, and memory all at once. That activation tells the brain this is important. Importance gets mistaken for likelihood. Statistics ask the brain to abstract, to imagine scale, to trust patterns rather than people. That requires effort. Emotional stories require almost none. They drop you into a moment. You feel what happened. The brain says, I understand this. Understanding feels like truth, even if the story is an exception. This is why a single dramatic example can outweigh a mountain of evidence. One story of betrayal makes trust feel dangerous. One story of failure makes success feel unlikely. The brain assumes that what it can vividly imagine must be representative. Vividness becomes a shortcut for probability. There is a mechanism behind this. Emotional stories activate the same neural systems used for personal experience. When you hear a detailed story, your brain simulates it. It reacts as if it happened to you. Heart rate shifts, attention narrows, memory encoding increases. Statistics do not trigger that simulation. They stay abstract. The brain does not feel them. Feeling is the key word. The brain trusts what it can feel. Numbers do not create sensation. Stories do. So when the two conflict, the brain sides with the story because it feels more concrete, more real, more actionable. This bias gets stronger under stress. When you are overwhelmed or uncertain, the brain looks for clarity fast. Emotional stories offer clear cause and effect. Someone did this and this happened. Statistics offer nuance, ranges, probabilities. The stressed brain does not want nuance. It wants direction. Stories provide that. There is also a social layer. Stories carry moral meaning. They imply lessons, warnings, heroes and villains. The brain is attuned to social information because social mistakes used to be costly. Numbers rarely tell you who to trust or avoid. Stories do. So the brain prioritizes them. The danger is that emotional stories are not designed to represent reality accurately. They are designed to be memorable. The more extreme the story, the more attention it gets. The brain then overestimates how common extreme events are. This is why rare tragedies can feel like constant threats. The stories repeat. The statistics stay the same. The brain also confuses emotional certainty with factual certainty. When a story makes you feel strongly, the conclusion feels obvious. You think anyone can see this. That confidence is emotional, not statistical. But it feels convincing because doubt drops, certainty feels good. Memory reinforces this bias. Emotional stories are easier to recall. The easier something is to recall, the more frequent it feels. The brain asks, how many examples can I think of? Emotional stories pop up quickly. Statistics do not. So the brain concludes the story represents reality. This shapes beliefs in subtle ways. You might intellectually accept the data, but emotionally live by the story. You say, I know the odds are low, but it still feels risky. That feeling drives behavior. The brain follows emotion first and logic second. The shift begins when you notice the difference between what moves you and what informs you. Emotional stories are powerful because they humanize. They are not useless. They remind you that behind every number is a person. But when they replace the numbers entirely, perspective collapses. The goal is not to suppress emotion. It is to contextualize it. When a story hits you hard, ask what it represents. Is it one case or a pattern? Does it illustrate possibility or probability? That pause gives statistics room to matter. Over time, you can train the brain to hold both. Let the story engage empathy. The false urgency created by emotional discomfort. That tight feeling shows up, and suddenly everything feels like it needs to happen now. You feel uncomfortable, restless, uneasy, and your mind jumps straight to action. Say something. Fix it. Decide. Escape. The discomfort itself creates a sense of urgency, as if waiting would make things worse. And in that moment, urgency feels logical, necessary, responsible. But most of the time, nothing is actually urgent. What is urgent is the feeling. The brain is wired to treat discomfort as a problem that must be solved immediately. Emotional discomfort signals potential threat. Not always physical threat, but psychological or social threat, uncertainty, rejection, loss of control. When those sensations appear, the brain shifts into action mode. It assumes that delay equals danger. Here is the shock. Emotional discomfort does not mean something bad is about to happen. It just means your nervous system is activated. But the brain does not distinguish between discomfort and emergency. It collapses them into the same category. Do something now or else. This is why awkward silences feel unbearable. Why unresolved conversations feel like ticking bombs. Why anxiety makes you want to decide right now, even when you have no clarity. The discomfort creates pressure. Pressure creates urgency. Urgency feels like wisdom. The brain prefers action over stillness because action creates the illusion of control. When you act, the discomfort often drops, even briefly. You send the message. You say the thing. You make the decision. Relief follows. The brain marks that relief as success. It concludes that urgency was justified. But relief is not evidence that the action was necessary. It only proves that acting changed your emotional state. The brain confuses emotional relief with problem solving. That confusion is what keeps the shortcut alive. This false urgency is especially strong when the discomfort involves uncertainty. Not knowing how someone feels. Not knowing what will happen next. Not knowing if you made the right move. Uncertainty leaves the brain without a story. So it creates urgency to force an answer. Any answer, just to close the loop. That is why people rush conversations they are not ready to have. Why they commit before they are sure. Why they quit when things feel uncomfortable but not actually harmful. The discomfort says this cannot wait. But the situation usually can. The brain learned this pattern early. When you were younger, emotional discomfort often did require immediate response. Crying brought care. Fear required protection. Discomfort was a signal that something needed attention now. That wiring remains, even though most adult discomfort does not require immediate action. The illusion deepens because urgency feels mature, decisive, proactive. Waiting feels passive, weak, like avoidance. So the brain frames urgency as strength. But urgency driven by discomfort is not clarity. It is escape. Notice how urgency shrinks your thinking. Options disappear. Nuance fades. The decision feels binary. Do or do not, stay or leave. Speak or stay silent forever. The brain narrows focus to end the discomfort as fast as possible. Long-term consequences barely register. This is why emotionally urgent decisions often get regretted, not because they were wrong in intention, but because they were made under pressure that was internal, not external. The discomfort demanded speed, not the situation. False urgency also feeds on stories. The brain imagines what might happen if you do nothing. They will forget me. I will lose my chance. This will get worse. Those imagined outcomes amplify discomfort, which amplifies urgency, which makes acting feel even more necessary. The loop accelerates. What the brain does not consider is that discomfort often peaks and falls on its own. Emotions are waves. They rise, crest, and settle. Urgency tells you the wave will only grow unless you act. That is rarely true. But the brain does not wait long enough to find out. The turning point is learning to separate discomfort from deadlines. Ask one simple question when urgency hits. What actually happens if I wait? Not what it feels like, but what objectively changes. Often the answer is nothing. The feeling changes. The situation does not. When you wait, even briefly, the nervous system begins to settle. As it settles, the urgency loses intensity. With less intensity, more options appear. Words come easier. Timing improves. What felt like a crisis reveals itself as a moment of discomfort, asking to be felt, not fixed. This does not mean ignoring real urgency. Some situations do require fast action, but real urgency comes with external constraints, time limits, safety risks, clear consequences. False urgency comes only with internal pressure. Learning this distinction is powerful. You stop letting discomfort set your schedule. You stop mistaking anxiety for intuition. You allow clarity to arrive instead of forcing it. If you have ever acted quickly, just to stop feeling uncomfortable, and later wondered why it did not actually solve anything, this is why. The brain used urgency as a shortcut to relief. It treated emotion like an emergency. Why the mind chooses immediate relief over long-term peace. There is a moment when discomfort shows up and your mind instantly starts negotiating with it. Not to understand it. Not to resolve it. Just to make it stop. You reach for distraction, reassurance, numbing, or quick fixes without even thinking. And afterward, there is relief. A noticeable drop in tension. That relief feels like proof you made the right choice. But that moment is where the trap is set. The mind is not designed to optimize long-term peace. It is designed to reduce immediate threat. Emotional discomfort registers as threat. Anxiety, guilt, loneliness, uncertainty all activate the same systems that once responded to danger. The brain reacts with urgency. Do something now so this feeling goes away. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Immediate relief is chemically rewarding. When discomfort drops suddenly, the brain releases calming neurochemicals. That shift feels good. It feels like safety returning. The brain learns quickly. Whatever you just did worked. Repeat it next time. Long-term peace does not come with that kind of instant reward. It is quiet, gradual, boring to the threat-driven brain. Peace builds slowly through tolerating discomfort, setting boundaries, delaying gratification, and staying present with feelings that do not resolve quickly. None of that creates a dramatic chemical payoff, so the brain undervalues it. The shock is that the mind often chooses relief even when it knows the cost. You know that avoiding the conversation keeps the tension alive. You know that numbing does not solve the problem. You know that reassurance seeking never fully satisfies. But in the moment, the desire to feel better now overrides the desire to feel better later. This happens because the brain heavily discounts the future. Long-term peace exists in a vague tomorrow. Immediate relief exists now in the body. The brain trusts what it can feel. It chooses the certainty of relief over the abstract promise of peace. Immediate relief also gives the illusion of progress. You feel calmer, so it feels like you handled something. The brain marks the situation as resolved even if the underlying issue is untouched. That false sense of completion is seductive. It closes the loop without doing the work. Over time, this creates patterns. You learn which behaviors reliably reduce discomfort fast. Checking your phone, overthinking, people-pleasing, emotional eating, withdrawing. These become default responses. The brain does not ask whether they lead to peace. It asks whether they lower distress quickly. If the answer is yes, the behavior stays. Long-term peace, on the other hand, often requires short-term discomfort. Sitting with anxiety instead of silencing it. Letting uncertainty exist without forcing answers. Saying no and tolerating guilt. Having the hard conversation instead of avoiding it. These choices feel worse before they feel better. The brain resists them because it mistakes discomfort for danger. There is also a control element. Immediate relief feels like control. You did something and the feeling changed. Long-term peace requires surrendering that control. You have to let feelings move on their own timeline. That feels risky. The brain prefers actions that guarantee an emotional shift, even if that shift is temporary. The mind also confuses familiarity with safety. Many relief behaviors are familiar because you have used them for years. Even if they keep you stuck, they are predictable. Peace requires new patterns. New patterns feel uncertain. Uncertainty triggers discomfort. So the brain runs back to what it knows. This is why people can be exhausted by their own coping strategies, yet still rely on them. The brain is not choosing what is best. It is choosing what is fastest. The cost shows up quietly. Relief wears off. The discomfort returns, often stronger. The underlying issue remains unresolved. Over time, you start living in cycles. Brief calm followed by recurring tension. The brain keeps promising relief, but peace never arrives because the conditions for peace were never allowed to form. Peace requires staying with discomfort long enough for it to teach you something. Relief cuts that process short. It silences the signal instead of listening to it. The brain never learns that the feeling itself is survivable, so it keeps sounding the alarm. The shift begins when you notice the trade being made. Ask yourself in moments of urgency whether you are choosing relief or peace. Relief wants this to stop now. Peace asks what this feeling is pointing to. Relief feels active. Peace feels slow. That slowness is what retrains the brain. When you delay relief even slightly, something important happens. The nervous system peaks and then settles on its own. The brain experiences discomfort without catastrophe. That experience is evidence. How emotional familiarity creates blind loyalty. There is a strange pull toward things that hurt in familiar ways. People stay loyal to situations, relationships, and beliefs that no longer serve them, not because they are good, but because they feel known. The discomfort has a shape. The reactions are predictable. The emotional environment is recognizable. That familiarity creates a sense of safety, even when the reality is painful. The brain does not define safety as good. It defines safety as predictable. Emotional familiarity gives the brain a map. It knows what comes next. It knows how to brace. It knows how to survive. So when something feels familiar emotionally, the brain relaxes its guard and calls it loyalty. Here is the unsettling part. Emotional familiarity often has nothing to do with truth, values, or alignment. It is purely pattern recognition. If you grew up around criticism, criticism feels like home. If chaos was normal, chaos feels alive. If love came with inconsistency, inconsistency feels meaningful. The brain confuses emotional recognition with trust. This is why people defend environments that drain them. They say things like "this is just how it is," or "they do not mean it that way," or "I know what to expect." Those explanations are not about reality. They are about regulation. The familiar emotional pattern keeps the nervous system oriented. Leaving it would mean stepping into the unknown. The shock is that unfamiliar peace often feels wrong. When the brain encounters calm that does not match its stored patterns, it gets suspicious. Where is the catch? When will this change? The lack of familiar tension feels unsafe. The brain would rather return to a known struggle than tolerate an unfamiliar ease. This is how blind loyalty forms. Not from belief, but from emotional conditioning. The brain attaches to what it recognizes, even if it hurts, because recognition lowers uncertainty. Loyalty becomes a survival strategy, not a moral one. There is also an identity layer. Familiar emotional patterns often shaped who you became. You learned how to cope, adapt, and endure within them. Letting go of the pattern can feel like erasing a part of yourself. The brain asks, if I am not this person in this situation, who am I? That question feels threatening. So the brain chooses loyalty to preserve identity. Emotional familiarity also distorts perception. When you are inside a known pattern, harmful behaviors feel normal. You minimize them. You explain them away. You focus on moments that fit the familiar narrative and ignore those that challenge it. The brain filters reality to protect the bond. This is why outside perspectives can feel irritating or offensive. When someone points out that something is unhealthy, it creates dissonance. Their observation threatens the familiar emotional structure. The brain reacts defensively. It says they do not understand. That reaction is not about truth. It is about protecting the known. Blind loyalty strengthens with repetition. The more times you stay, excuse, adapt, or endure, the deeper the neural pathway becomes. The pattern feels solid, stable. Leaving starts to feel like betrayal, even if the loyalty has never been returned. The brain also mistakes endurance for commitment. If you have invested a lot of emotional energy into something, the brain wants that investment to mean something. It tells you that staying proves strength. That leaving would invalidate the effort. This sunk emotional cost keeps you loyal long after the value is gone. What makes this especially powerful is that emotional familiarity often brings moments of relief. Even in unhealthy patterns, there are brief returns to normal. Those moments feel grounding. The brain clings to them as evidence that the loyalty is justified. It ignores the overall cost. Breaking blind loyalty is hard because it requires tolerating unfamiliar emotions. Grief, disorientation, guilt, freedom mixed with fear. The brain resists this because it cannot predict how these feelings will unfold. It would rather endure a known pain than navigate unknown ones. The shift begins when you separate familiarity from safety. Ask yourself not what feels known, but what actually supports your well-being. This question often creates discomfort because the answer challenges the pattern. That discomfort is a sign that the brain is losing its emotional anchor. As you step away from familiar patterns, there is often a withdrawal period. The absence of the known emotional environment feels empty. The brain may try to pull you back by romanticizing the past or amplifying fear. This is not intuition. It is conditioning looking for its fix. Over time, new emotional experiences start to register. Consistency without chaos, care without tension, boundaries without abandonment. At first, these feel flat or unreal, but with repetition, the brain begins to recognize them as safe. A new familiarity forms. If you have the brain's habit of filling gaps with emotional assumptions, your brain hates empty space. Not physical space, but informational space. The moment something is unclear, unfinished, or unexplained, the mind rushes in to fill it. A look that lingers too long, a tone that feels off, a detail that is missing. Before you realize it, your brain has already supplied an explanation, and that explanation almost always carries emotional weight. You do not experience the gap. You experience the story that fills it. This happens because uncertainty feels unsafe. When the brain does not know what something means, it cannot predict what comes next. Prediction is how it maintains a sense of control. So when information is incomplete, the brain does not wait patiently, it guesses, and it does not guess neutrally. It guesses emotionally. Here is the shock. The brain does not fill gaps with the most likely explanation. It fills them with the explanation that best matches your current emotional state. If you feel insecure, the gap gets filled with rejection. If you feel anxious, the gap becomes danger. If you feel guilty, the gap turns into blame. The emotion comes first. The assumption follows. This is why the same silence can feel peaceful one day and devastating the next. The external situation is identical. The internal state is not. The brain uses emotion as context, then writes a story that fits. Emotion is fast, faster than logic. So when a gap appears, emotion rushes in to close it before reason has time to ask questions. That speed feels like intuition. The assumption feels obvious. You do not think I am making this up. You think I just know. But what you know is how the gap feels, not what it means. The brain evolved this way for efficiency. In early environments, waiting for full information was dangerous. If you heard a noise and hesitated to interpret it, you might not survive. So the brain learned to assume quickly. Better to be wrong and safe than accurate and late. That wiring still runs today, even when the stakes are emotional instead of physical. The problem is that emotional assumptions are rarely checked. Once the brain fills a gap, it treats the story as fact. It reacts accordingly. Your mood shifts. Your behavior changes. Your perception narrows. The assumption becomes self-reinforcing because everything you do next is shaped by it. If you assume someone is upset with you, you become guarded. Your tone changes. They respond differently. The brain then says, "See, I was right." The original gap disappears, replaced by a chain of reactions that make the assumption feel proven. This is how misunderstandings grow without anyone ever stating anything directly. The gap was small. The assumption was large. The brain prefers emotional assumptions because they create coherence. Even a painful story is better than no story. Uncertainty feels chaotic. A negative explanation at least gives structure. The brain can orient around it, prepare for it, defend against it. There is also a memory effect. When you fill gaps emotionally, those assumptions get stored alongside the event. Later, when you remember what happened, the assumption feels like it was part of the experience. You do not remember guessing. You remember knowing. Over time, these emotional fillings accumulate and form beliefs about yourself and others. I am always overlooked. People lose interest. I mess things up. These are not observations. They are stories built from gaps that were never verified. What makes this especially convincing is emotional familiarity. If an assumption matches old emotional patterns, the brain trusts it more. It feels consistent. Familiar pain feels truthful. So the brain keeps using the same explanations whenever a gap appears. This is why certain situations are triggering. Not because of what is happening, but because of what is missing. The lack of clarity activates old emotional templates, and the brain fills the gap with the same assumptions it always has. The cost is that reality becomes distorted without you noticing. You stop responding to what is actually happening and start responding to what you think is happening. Emotional assumptions quietly replace direct experience. The shift begins when you notice the moment of filling. That brief instant when something is unclear and your mind rushes to explain it. There is often a spike of emotion there. Tightness, heat, a drop in mood. That sensation is the clue. It signals that the brain just closed a gap. Instead of accepting the first explanation, slow it down. Ask what you actually know versus what you are assuming. This does not mean forcing a positive interpretation. It means leaving the gap open a little longer. Leaving gaps open feels uncomfortable. The brain will protest. It wants closure. But when you tolerate that discomfort, something changes. You stop feeding emotional assumptions. You give reality time to show itself. Often, the truth arrives without effort. A clarification, a response, a shift in context. And when it does, you realize how much weight the assumption was carrying. Over time, practicing this rewires the brain. It learns that not every gap is a threat. That not knowing is survivable. That clarity does not always require invention. If you have ever looked back and realized you reacted strongly to something that was why emotional validation feels like truth. There is a moment when someone nods, agrees, or says that makes sense, and suddenly everything inside you settles. Your thoughts feel clearer. Your feelings feel justified. The story you were telling yourself clicks into place. That feeling is powerful. It feels like confirmation, like truth just landed. But what actually happened was validation, not verification. Emotional validation feels like truth because it soothes uncertainty. When you are distressed, confused, or hurt, the brain is not primarily searching for accuracy. It is searching for relief. Validation provides that relief by saying your feelings make sense. The nervous system relaxes. Tension drops. The brain interprets that drop as resolution. Here is the shock. Relief is not evidence, but the brain treats it as if it is. When someone validates your emotions, your brain experiences social alignment. Another nervous system is matching yours. That synchrony is deeply regulating. Humans evolved to depend on shared emotional reality. If others felt what you felt, you were safer. So when someone mirrors your emotional experience, the brain reads it as confirmation that your interpretation of reality is correct. The brain does not separate feeling understood from being right. Those two experiences overlap heavily. When you feel understood, the emotional alarm quiets down. The mind stops questioning. Doubt fades. Certainty rises, and certainty feels like truth. This is why validation can be intoxicating, especially when you are hurt or insecure. If someone says, "Of course you feel that way," the internal debate ends. You stop interrogating the story. The brain says we have consensus. Case closed. But emotional validation only confirms that your feelings are real, not that the conclusions drawn from them are accurate. Feeling angry does not automatically mean you were wronged. Feeling anxious does not mean danger is present. Feeling rejected does not mean rejection occurred. Validation skips that distinction. The brain loves skipping steps. It saves energy. When validation arrives, the brain collapses emotion and meaning into one package. If this feels true and someone else agrees, it must be true. That shortcut feels efficient and satisfying. This is why venting can sometimes make things worse. When you share an emotional story and receive strong validation, the story hardens. The brain reinforces the narrative because it was socially rewarded. Each nod, each agreement strengthens the emotional pathway. The feeling feels more justified. The story feels more factual. Over time, validated emotions turn into beliefs, not because they were examined, but because they were affirmed. The brain remembers how supported it felt and associates that support with the explanation you gave. The explanation gains emotional credibility. This is especially potent in groups. Shared emotional validation creates shared reality. If everyone feels outraged, the outrage feels unquestionably right. Dissent feels threatening, not because it is wrong, but because it disrupts emotional alignment. The brain protects consensus because consensus once meant survival. The danger is subtle. Validation discourages curiosity. Once your feelings are validated, questioning the underlying assumptions can feel like betrayal of yourself or of the person who validated you. The brain resists that because it wants to preserve the sense of being understood. There is also an identity element. When your emotions are validated, your self-image stabilizes. I am reasonable. My reactions make sense. That stability feels good. Challenging the story later risks destabilizing that identity. So the brain clings to the validated version. This is why emotional validation can feel more convincing than facts. Facts require integration. They may complicate the story. Validation simplifies. It says you are right to feel this way. Simplicity feels safe. The brain also uses validation as a shortcut for trust. If someone validates your feelings, you trust them more. That trust then spills over into trusting the interpretation they implicitly endorse. The emotional bond amplifies the belief. None of this means validation is bad. Emotional validation is essential for regulation. It helps people feel seen and safe. The problem arises when validation is mistaken for confirmation of reality rather than confirmation of experience. The shift begins when you separate two questions. Do my feelings make sense and is my interpretation accurate? The first often deserves yes. The second requires curiosity. Validation answers the first question. It does not answer the second. You can be emotionally validated and still wrong about what caused the feeling. Both can coexist. The brain struggles with this because it prefers clean conclusions. But holding that complexity is where clarity grows. When you notice yourself feeling extremely certain after being validated, pause. Notice how good that certainty feels. That feeling is the signal. It tells you relief just happened, not necessarily truth discovery. Learning to appreciate validation without freezing the story takes practice. It means letting how the brain confuses emotional confidence with accuracy. There is a certain tone that makes a statement feel unquestionable. Someone says something with certainty, or you feel something strongly enough, and the conclusion feels locked in. No hesitation, no doubt. It feels obvious. The confidence itself becomes the evidence. And once that happens, accuracy quietly steps out of the conversation. The brain is deeply persuaded by confidence because confidence feels like knowing. When an emotion arrives with strength and clarity, the mind assumes it must be based on solid information. If you feel sure, you must be right. If you hesitate, you must be missing something. That shortcut saves time, but it also bypasses truth. Here is the shock. Emotional confidence is not a measure of correctness. It is a measure of intensity. The brain does not naturally distinguish between how strongly something is felt and how accurate it is. Strong feelings activate certainty circuits. Weak feelings activate doubt. Accuracy does not factor in automatically. This is why people can be confidently wrong and unconsciously persuasive. When someone speaks with emotional conviction, your brain responds to the confidence before it evaluates the content. Confidence signals authority. Authority signals safety. The brain relaxes its skepticism and accepts the message. The same thing happens internally. When you feel strongly about an interpretation, the strength of the feeling convinces you that the interpretation is true. You do not think I feel very sure. You think I know. The emotional certainty collapses the space where questioning would live. The brain prefers this because doubt is uncomfortable. Doubt requires holding multiple possibilities at once. That takes effort. Emotional confidence simplifies everything into one clear path, one explanation, one decision. That clarity feels calming, especially under stress. Stress amplifies this shortcut. When you are anxious, overwhelmed, or emotionally activated, the brain prioritizes speed. It wants resolution now. Emotional confidence delivers fast closure. The stronger the feeling, the faster the brain commits to the conclusion attached to it. This is why fear feels so convincing. When fear is strong, the danger feels undeniable. When anger is intense, the injustice feels obvious. When attraction is powerful, the connection feels meaningful. The emotion brings confidence, and confidence masquerades as truth. There is also a memory effect. When you recall moments where you felt certain, the outcome gets rewritten to match the feeling. If you felt confident and things turned out okay, the brain credits the confidence. If you felt confident and were wrong, the brain often forgets the confidence or reframes it. Memory protects the shortcut. Emotional confidence is especially persuasive when it aligns with identity. If a belief fits who you think you are, confidence comes easily. The brain defends identity fiercely. Confidence in those beliefs feels righteous. Questioning them feels threatening. So the brain treats confidence as a shield. This is how opinions harden into convictions. The more emotionally invested you become, the more confident you feel. The more confident you feel, the less open you are to contradictory information. Accuracy becomes secondary to coherence. The story just has to feel right. The danger is subtle. Emotional confidence shuts down curiosity. When you feel certain, you stop checking. You stop listening. You stop updating. The brain assumes the work is done. This is efficient, but it freezes learning. What makes this illusion convincing is that confidence often comes with fluency. Thoughts flow easily. Words come quickly. The brain interprets ease as mastery. If something is easy to think or say, it must be correct. Struggle gets mistaken for error, when often struggle is where accuracy lies. The brain also confuses repetition with certainty. The more times you repeat an emotionally charged belief, the more confident it feels. Familiar thoughts require less effort. Less effort feels right. Over time, the belief feels solid not because it was tested, but because it was rehearsed. Breaking this shortcut does not mean distrusting all confidence. Confidence can be useful. It helps you act. It helps you commit. The problem is letting confidence stand in for evidence. When confidence becomes the proof, accuracy becomes optional. The shift begins when you notice the feeling of certainty itself, that internal click where something feels settled. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" ask, "Why does this feel so certain?" That question creates a pause. In that pause, the brain has room to separate emotion from evaluation. Accuracy often feels quieter than confidence. It comes with caveats, with nuance, with an awareness of what you do not know. The brain finds that less satisfying, especially when emotions are high. But that quietness is often a sign that more systems are engaged. Learning to tolerate uncertainty weakens the shortcut. When you allow yourself to hold a belief without full emotional certainty, you keep the door open. You can still act, but you stay flexible. You remain able to revise. If you have ever been completely sure about something and later realized you were wrong, this is why. The brain trusted how strongly you felt instead of how well the belief was supported. Emotional confidence felt like accuracy because it reduced doubt. Once you see this pattern, confidence loses its authority as proof. The shortcut that turns coincidence into meaning. Something happens twice and your mind leans forward. You notice a number repeating. You think of someone and they text you. Two unrelated events line up just enough to feel intentional. And almost instantly, your brain says this is not random. This means something. That leap feels natural, even comforting. It feels like you just uncovered a hidden signal in the noise. The brain is not satisfied with randomness. Randomness feels empty. Meaning feels grounding. So when coincidences appear, the brain does not leave them alone. It connects the dots even when the dots were never meant to be connected. Here is the shock. The brain is not actually detecting meaning. It is manufacturing it, and it does so automatically. Humans evolved as pattern seekers. Pattern recognition kept us alive. If certain sounds preceded danger, noticing that pattern mattered. If certain seasons meant scarcity, connecting those signals mattered. So the brain became extremely good at linking events. Too good. It would rather see a false pattern than miss a real one. Coincidences trigger that system perfectly. Two events overlap in time, emotion, or symbolism, and the brain lights up. It says, "Pay attention. Something is happening here." The emotional charge tells the brain this is important, even when there is no causal link. What makes this shortcut convincing is timing. When events occur close together, the brain assumes connection. If something happens after a thought or feeling, the brain assumes the thought caused it or predicted it. The brain is far less interested in probability than proximity. Emotion amplifies this. Coincidences that happen during emotionally charged moments feel especially meaningful. If you are stressed, lonely, hopeful, or searching for answers, your brain is already primed to look for signs. The coincidence lands like confirmation. It feels personal, tailored, as if the world responded to your internal state. The brain loves this because it restores a sense of order. Coincidence without meaning feels chaotic. Coincidence with meaning feels like guidance. The brain prefers guidance even if it is invented because it reduces uncertainty. Memory plays a big role here. The brain remembers meaningful coincidences and forgets the countless meaningless ones. You do not remember every time you thought of someone and they did not call. You remember the one time they did. That selective memory makes coincidences feel rare and special, even though they are statistically inevitable. The brain also retrofits meaning after the fact. When something unexpected happens, the mind scans recent thoughts and emotions to find something that matches. Once it finds a match, it links them. The link feels obvious in hindsight. You think I knew it, or I had a feeling. But that feeling is constructed after the event, not before it. This shortcut is especially powerful when identity is involved. If you already believe things happen for a reason, coincidences reinforce that belief. If you feel lost, coincidences feel like direction. If you feel uncertain, coincidences feel like reassurance. The brain uses meaning to stabilize identity and mood. There is also a control illusion hiding here. Meaningful coincidences make you feel less at the mercy of randomness. They suggest there is a pattern you can tune into. That feels empowering. The idea that events are guided or connected feels safer than the idea that many things just happen. But the cost is subtle. When you treat coincidence as meaning, you may overinterpret neutral events. You may make decisions based on signals that were never signals. The brain fills in intention where there was none, and then acts as if that intention is real. This is how people stay stuck. They wait for signs instead of making choices. They assign meaning to delays, obstacles, or chance encounters, and let those interpretations steer behavior. The coincidence becomes a compass, even though it has no direction built into it. The brain also struggles with scale. In a world with billions of people and constant information flow, coincidences are guaranteed. The brain does not intuitively grasp large numbers. So when something unlikely happens to you, it feels extraordinary. The brain forgets how many opportunities there were for it to happen. What makes this shortcut emotionally sticky is the feeling of insight. When a coincidence clicks into meaning, there is a small rush, a sense of understanding. The brain rewards that feeling. It feels like discovery. But discovery and invention feel very similar from the inside. None of this means coincidences are meaningless in how they affect you. They can inspire reflection. They can prompt awareness. The problem is assuming they contain instructions or truth about how things are supposed to be. That assumption gives coincidence authority it did not earn. The shift happens when you separate meaning from causation. A coincidence can feel meaningful without being meaningful in a literal sense. It can move you without directing you. When you notice the urge to interpret, pause and ask what story you are adding. Often the story says more about your current emotional state than about the event itself. The coincidence becomes a mirror, not a message. Why emotional pain feels personal even when it's random. Sometimes pain lands so precisely it feels aimed. A rejection, a loss, a harsh comment at the wrong moment. And the first thought is not "this happened." The thought is "this happened to me." It feels targeted, personal, as if life singled you out and pressed exactly where it knew it would hurt. That reaction feels automatic because it is. The brain does not experience emotional pain as neutral data. It experiences it as a message about you, about your worth, your safety, your place. Even when the cause was random, the pain feels intentional. Here is the shock. Emotional pain is not processed as an event. It is processed as a threat to identity. When something hurts emotionally, the brain immediately asks why. Not in a philosophical way, but in a survival way. Why did this happen, and what does it say about me? The brain evolved to personalize pain because, historically, pain often did mean danger, exclusion, or loss of status. Those were life-threatening conditions in social species. So when pain appears, the brain assumes meaning. Randomness does not feel safe. If something hurts, the brain believes there must be a reason, and that reason must involve you. This is why emotional pain feels so intimate. Physical pain stays in the body. Emotional pain spreads into the self. The brain ties it to memory, self-concept, and future expectations. It says, remember this. Avoid this. Protect yourself from this again. The problem is that the brain is not good at distinguishing random impact from intentional cause. If you get caught in the emotional crossfire of someone else's stress, the pain still registers as a signal about your value. If timing goes wrong, the brain does not care about probability. It cares about impact. Emotion also collapses scale. A single painful moment can feel like evidence of a larger pattern. The brain generalizes quickly. This happened because this is how things go for me. One experience becomes a story. The pain feels personal because it gets woven into identity. Memory strengthens this illusion. The brain stores emotional pain with high priority. It remembers not just what happened, but how it felt. Later, when something similar occurs, the memory activates before logic can intervene. The pain feels familiar. Familiar pain feels personal. It feels like confirmation. There is also an egocentric bias at play. The brain experiences the world from inside your perspective. It naturally overestimates your role in events. If something affected you deeply, the brain assumes you were central to it. The idea that it was random feels dismissive to the emotional system. This is especially true with rejection. Social pain lights up the same brain regions as physical pain. The brain treats exclusion as a survival threat. So it searches for a reason, and the easiest reason is you. Something must be wrong with me. That explanation feels awful, but it feels stable. It gives the pain a place to land. Randomness leaves pain floating. Personalization anchors it. The brain also prefers self-blame over uncertainty. Self-blame feels controllable. If it was my fault, I can fix it. Random pain means it could happen again without warning. That unpredictability is terrifying. So the brain chooses a painful explanation that feels safer. This is why people internalize things that had nothing to do with them. A bad mood, a missed opportunity, a chance loss. The brain says this reflects me because that is less scary than this just happened. Emotion magnifies this further. When you are already tired, stressed, or vulnerable, the brain is more likely to personalize pain. Your emotional defenses are low. The pain slips straight into identity. It feels like proof of something you already feared. But pain does not care about fairness or meaning. It is often the result of intersecting circumstances, timing, and other people's internal worlds. The brain is not built to sit with that complexity. It wants a simple story. Personal stories are the simplest. The cost of this shortcut is heavy. When you take random pain personally, you carry weight that was never yours. You shape your future behavior around a false conclusion. You avoid. You shrink. You protect against a threat that was never aimed. The shift begins when you notice the personalization itself. That moment when pain turns into a statement about who you are. Pause there. Separate the sensation from the story. The hurt is real. The meaning you added may not be. You can acknowledge the pain without assigning it intent. You can say this hurt without saying this was about me. That distinction creates space. In that space, the nervous system can calm without rewriting identity. Over time, the brain can learn that not all pain carries a message. Some pain is just friction between lives, timing, and chance. It still hurts, but it does not define. If you have ever wondered why emotional pain cuts so deeply and feels so personal, even when it came out of nowhere, this is why. The brain treats pain as information about you, not about circumstance. And once you see that, the pain can still. How the brain uses emotion to avoid uncertainty. Uncertainty creates a specific kind of discomfort. It is not loud like fear or sharp like anger. It is quiet, hovering, unresolved. And the brain hates it, not because uncertainty is dangerous by default, but because the brain does not know how to rest inside it. so it reaches for emotion to end the waiting. When you do not know what something means, what will happen, or where things are headed, emotion steps in fast. A feeling appears, and suddenly the unknown has a shape. Anxiety says something is wrong. Hope says something good is coming. Anger says someone is at fault. Any of those feels better than not knowing. Here is the shock. Emotion is not responding to uncertainty. It is being used to eliminate it. The brain evolved to prefer fast conclusions over accurate ones when information is incomplete. In uncertain situations, waiting for clarity once meant vulnerability, so the brain learned to resolve ambiguity quickly. Emotion is the fastest tool it has. Emotion provides instant narrative. It answers questions before they are fully asked. If you feel anxious, the brain assumes threat. If you feel excited, it assumes opportunity. The feeling becomes the conclusion. Uncertainty disappears, replaced by emotional certainty. This is why emotions feel clarifying even when they are misleading. They reduce mental load. Instead of holding multiple possibilities, the brain commits to one emotional explanation. That commitment feels like relief. The nervous system plays a big role here. Uncertainty keeps the system activated. The body stays alert. Emotion gives the system something to organize around. Even negative emotions can feel stabilizing because they are specific. Specific feels safer than unknown. Fear is a perfect example. Fear narrows focus. It says do this or avoid that. The brain prefers that clarity to the wide-open discomfort of not knowing what matters. Fear may be painful, but it is decisive. Anger works the same way. When something is unclear or unfair, but ambiguous, anger assigns blame. It simplifies complexity into a target. That target creates certainty. Someone caused this. Something is wrong. Action feels possible again. Even sadness can function this way. When an outcome is unclear, sadness can settle the question by assuming loss. That assumption hurts, but it closes the loop. The brain stops scanning for alternatives. It grieves instead of waiting. Emotion also shortcuts prediction. The brain is constantly trying to predict the future. Uncertainty disrupts that. Emotion fills the gap with expectation. Anxiety predicts danger. Optimism predicts success. The prediction may be wrong, but the brain feels prepared. This is why people cling to emotional interpretations, even when facts are missing. The emotion gives them a sense of knowing. And knowing, even falsely, feels better than floating. Memory reinforces this shortcut. The brain remembers times when emotion led to fast decisions that seemed to work. It does not remember all the times emotion created unnecessary suffering. The memory bias strengthens the habit. There is also a social layer. Emotional certainty is easier to communicate than uncertainty. Saying I feel sure invites alignment. Saying I do not know invites discomfort. The brain learns that emotion brings connection while uncertainty feels isolating. Identity gets involved too. People often define themselves by how they feel about things. Strong emotions create strong positions. Those positions reduce uncertainty about who you are and where you stand. Questioning them feels destabilizing. The cost of using emotion to avoid uncertainty is subtle but serious. When emotion decides too early, learning stops. The brain closes the file. New information feels intrusive rather than informative. You defend the emotional conclusion because it restored stability. This is how misunderstandings persist, how assumptions harden, how temporary feelings become permanent beliefs. Emotion solved the discomfort of not knowing, but it did so by freezing interpretation. The brain does not naturally reward sitting with uncertainty. It takes conscious effort to pause before emotion finalizes the story. That pause feels uncomfortable because the nervous system is still activated. But that discomfort is not danger. It is just unresolved information. When you allow uncertainty to exist without immediately resolving it emotionally, the brain slowly learns that it can survive without instant answers. The nervous system settles without needing a narrative. Curiosity replaces urgency. This does not mean suppressing emotion. Emotions still arise. The difference is not letting them answer questions they were never meant to answer. Feeling anxious does not mean something is wrong. Feeling hopeful does not mean something will work out. The emotion is information about your state, not about reality. The shift happens when you notice the moment emotion offers certainty. That internal click where things feel decided. Instead of accepting it, you ask what uncertainty is being avoided. That question reopens space. Over time, you may notice that uncertainty loses some of its threat. It becomes a temporary condition, not an emergency. Emotion still shows up, but it no longer has the illusion that strong feelings equal deep insight. There are moments when a realization hits with force. A surge of emotion, goosebumps, a sense of clarity so sharp it feels like you just uncovered something profound. It feels deeper than logic, deeper than thought. You think this is it. This feeling means I finally understand something important. That moment is seductive, because strong feelings feel like insight. The brain treats intensity as significance. When an idea arrives wrapped in emotion, it feels elevated, important, true in a way that quiet thoughts never seem to be. The feeling itself becomes the proof that you have touched something real. Here is the shock. Emotional intensity is not depth, it is activation. Strong feelings do not signal that an idea is more accurate or more insightful. They signal that the nervous system has been stimulated. The brain confuses that stimulation with understanding because both create a sense of coherence. Everything suddenly feels aligned even if nothing new was actually learned. Insight is usually quiet. It unfolds slowly. It often feels uncertain at first. Emotional intensity is loud and immediate. The brain prefers loud. Loud feels convincing. When emotion spikes, several systems fire at once. Attention narrows. Distractions fall away. Thoughts organize around one central idea. That focus feels like clarity. But focus and accuracy are not the same thing. You can be intensely focused on a flawed interpretation. The brain evolved to treat strong emotions as signals of importance. If something triggered fear or excitement in the past, it often mattered for survival. So intensity became a shortcut. Strong feeling equals pay attention. Weak feeling equals ignore. That shortcut made sense when threats were physical and immediate. It does not translate cleanly to modern thinking. This is why ideas encountered during emotional states feel profound. A thought that appears during sadness feels deep. A belief formed during anger feels righteous. A realization during awe feels transcendent. The emotion colors the thought and gives it weight. The brain then attributes that weight to the idea itself rather than to the state it arose from. There is also a timing illusion. Emotional insight feels sudden. Sudden feels powerful. The brain equates speed with truth. If something clicks instantly, it feels like recognition rather than construction. You feel like you uncovered something that was always there, but often what happened is that emotion lowered resistance. It bypassed critical filters. The idea did not pass more tests, it passed fewer. Memory reinforces this illusion. The brain remembers emotionally charged realizations more vividly. They stand out against neutral thoughts. Over time, you recall them as turning points. You forget the many intense insights that later proved shallow or wrong. The body plays a role too. Emotion brings physical sensations, tightness, warmth, energy. Those sensations anchor the idea in the body. Embodied ideas feel more real. The brain trusts what it can feel. This is why music, speeches, and moments of collective emotion can feel deeply insightful. The emotion synchronizes bodies. That synchrony feels like shared truth, but the depth comes from alignment, not necessarily understanding. The danger is that emotional insight resists scrutiny. When an idea feels profound, questioning it feels like diminishing it. The brain protects the feeling. It does not want to lose the sense of meaning, so it defends the idea even when evidence is thin. This is how people build worldviews around moments rather than analysis. A single intense experience becomes a foundation. The feeling becomes a compass. But feelings fluctuate. Depth requires stability across emotional states. True insight often survives boredom. It holds up when the emotion fades. It still makes sense the next day. Emotional insight often evaporates once the nervous system settles. What felt profound becomes obvious or empty. The brain rarely checks for this. It assumes that because something felt deep, it was deep. The emotional memory overwrites later evaluation. There is also an identity payoff. Feeling like you had a deep insight makes you feel perceptive, awake, a step ahead. The brain enjoys that self-image. It reinforces the belief that intensity equals wisdom. But depth is not about how strongly something hits you. It is about how well it integrates with reality, how many angles it survives, how much it explains without collapsing under complexity. Emotion can open the door to insight. It can draw attention. It can motivate exploration. But it is not the insight itself. When emotion does the concluding instead of the inviting, depth gets replaced by certainty. The shift happens when you notice the intensity without bowing to it. When a realization feels huge, pause, let the feeling crest and pass. Revisit the idea when you are calm. See what remains when the emotional amplification is gone. If it still holds, it may be insight. If it shrinks, it was emotion wearing insight's clothing. Strong feelings are compelling. They make moments feel meaningful. Why emotional expectations shape what we perceive. Before anything actually happens, something already happened inside you. An expectation formed, quietly, automatically, and by the time the moment arrives, you are not really seeing what is there. You are seeing what you were emotionally prepared to see. This happens so fast it feels like perception. It does not feel like interpretation. You think you are reacting to reality, but your brain has already decided what reality should feel like. Here is the shock. Emotion does not follow perception. Perception follows emotion. The brain is predictive by nature. It is constantly guessing what comes next in order to save energy. Emotional expectations are part of that prediction system. If you expect something to hurt, the brain scans for threat. If you expect rejection, it looks for distance. If you expect warmth, it notices softness. The expectation sets the filter. This means two people can experience the same event and walk away with entirely different realities. Not because one is lying, but because their emotional expectations shaped what they noticed, emphasized, and ignored. Emotion primes attention. When you feel anxious, your brain prioritizes information that confirms danger. Neutral details fade into the background. When you feel hopeful, the brain highlights opportunity and downplays risk. The sensory input is the same. The emotional lens is different. The brain does this to reduce uncertainty. If it already has a prediction, it can move faster. Emotional expectations give it a head start. The cost is accuracy. The benefit is efficiency. This is why first impressions matter so much. The first emotional expectation creates a baseline. Everything after gets compared to it. If the baseline is negative, neutral behavior feels suspicious. If the baseline is positive, warning signs feel minor. The brain protects its initial prediction because updating it requires effort. There is also a memory loop involved. Emotional expectations are built from past experiences. If something hurt before, the brain expects it to hurt again. That expectation shapes perception, which then reinforces the memory. The loop tightens. It starts to feel like proof. For example, if you expect criticism, your brain hears it even when it is not there. Tone gets interpreted as judgment. Silence feels disapproval. The emotional expectation fills in gaps. The brain hates gaps. It would rather assume than wait. This shortcut is especially strong in relationships. Emotional history creates expectations that shape every interaction. A delayed response feels intentional. A short answer feels cold. The brain reacts to the expectation, not the message itself. The body gets involved too. Emotional expectations prepare the nervous system. Muscles tense. Heart rate shifts. That physical state influences perception. When the body is braced, the world feels sharper, harsher. The brain trusts bodily signals, so the perception feels justified. The brain also confuses consistency with correctness. If your emotional expectations keep getting confirmed, it feels like you are seeing clearly. But often you are just repeatedly seeing through the same lens. The brain rewards that consistency because it feels stable. What makes this illusion dangerous is that it feels passive. You do not feel like you are doing anything. You feel like things are just happening to you. The expectation is invisible because it feels like common sense. Emotion also biases interpretation of ambiguity. Ambiguous situations are especially vulnerable. The brain uses emotional expectations to decide what ambiguous signals mean. A vague comment becomes an insult or a compliment depending on what you expected. This is not a flaw. It is how the brain manages limited information. But when emotional expectations go unexamined, perception becomes rigid. You stop seeing what is new. You only see what fits. Over time, this can lock people into patterns. You expect disappointment, so you perceive it everywhere. That perception reinforces the expectation. The world feels consistently disappointing, even when it is not. Breaking this shortcut does not mean removing emotion. It means noticing it before it becomes the narrator. The shift starts when you ask what you were expecting to feel before you reacted. That question reveals the lens. When you name the expectation, it loosens. The brain gains space to update. You may still feel the emotion, but it no longer dictates the entire interpretation. This is especially powerful in moments of surprise. When something feels stronger than it should, pause. Ask what expectation was violated or confirmed. Often the reaction is not about what happened, but about what you were emotionally ready for. Perception feels objective, but it is deeply influenced by anticipation. The brain sees through feeling first, fact second. That is why emotional expectations shape reality so convincingly. If you have ever felt certain about what something meant and later realized you misread it, this is why. Your emotional expectation filled in the meaning before the information arrived. The brain trusted the feeling because it arrived first. Once you see this pattern, perception becomes more flexible. You still feel, you still expect, but you also notice the filter. And in that awareness, reality has a chance to show up as it is, not just as you feared or hoped it would be. How the brain mistakes emotional reaction for moral judgment. There is a moment when something happens and your chest tightens, your stomach twists, your blood pressure rises. You feel outrage, disgust, or shock. The feeling is immediate, unmistakable, and the brain takes that feeling and calls it a verdict. This is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is evil. The reaction becomes judgment, instantly, automatically, and you rarely question it. The brain loves shortcuts. Moral reasoning is slow. It requires weighing evidence, imagining consequences, considering context, and integrating perspectives. Emotional reactions are fast. They are chemical, embodied, and undeniable. So the brain often substitutes the slow, laborious process with the quick signal from the body. Feeling bad about something equals it being bad. Feeling right about something equals it being right. Here is the shock. The intensity of your feeling is not a measure of moral truth. It is a measure of your nervous system firing. The stronger the emotional reaction, the more convincing it feels. But the emotion does not guarantee accuracy. This is why people can be vehemently certain about moral judgments that, upon reflection, are inconsistent or contextually flawed. The brain interprets the body's alarm system as authority. Anger, disgust, or horror signals importance. That importance gets reframed as moral clarity. You feel it, and the mind says, I am certain. That certainty feels ethical. The brain evolved this way because emotions were useful social signals. Feeling disgust toward spoiled food, fear of predators, or anger at unfair treatment had survival value. Emotions indicated right action quickly, even without full reasoning. Over time, that mechanism generalized. Strong negative feelings signal danger or wrongdoing. Strong positive feelings signal safety or virtue. The shortcut persists even when the stakes are abstract moral questions rather than immediate survival. Emotion also simplifies ambiguity. Many moral dilemmas are complicated. They involve trade-offs, context, and uncertainty. The brain doesn't like sitting in that complexity. Emotional reaction collapses ambiguity into certainty. The feeling provides closure. You don't have to weigh the nuances. The body decided for you. Memory reinforces this shortcut. When emotional reactions coincide with moral action, the brain links the feeling with correctness. Later, encountering a similar situation, the brain calls up the emotional pattern and interprets it as judgment. Strong reactions create confidence. Confidence feels like moral authority. Social reinforcement amplifies it. Expressing moral outrage often earns validation. Others mirror your feelings. You feel aligned with the group. The brain interprets that social affirmation as evidence that your judgment is accurate. The shortcut strengthens. Emotional reaction becomes moral judgment, and the community's reaction reinforces the illusion. There is also an identity element. Emotions signal personal values. Feeling outraged confirms who you are: compassionate, fair, protective, or principled. The brain links moral authority to emotional certainty because it protects identity. Questioning the feeling feels like questioning yourself. That makes it harder to separate reaction from judgment. The danger is subtle. You act on what feels right rather than what is justifiable. You may condemn without full understanding. You may defend without evidence. Emotional reasoning is persuasive, immediate, and compelling, but it can also mislead. The shift begins with noticing the emotional signal before it becomes a verdict. Recognize the body's response: tight chest, racing heart, flushing, clenching. Name the emotion: anger, disgust, shock. Then pause and ask, does this feeling reflect the full context? Is it a reaction or is it a reasoned judgment? Emotions can guide moral reasoning, but they should not replace it. The key is using the feeling as data, not as law. Emotional intensity signals importance, not truth. Emotional clarity feels moral, but it is often only personal and immediate. If you have ever felt morally certain in the heat of a moment, only to reconsider later, this is why. The brain took a visceral reaction and read it as a verdict. The shortcut made your body the judge. Once you see that pattern, you can separate feeling from judgment. You can feel deeply without assuming the feeling is the final moral answer. In that space, moral reasoning becomes deliberate, reflective, and less prone to the illusions of immediacy. Emotion informs, it does not rule, and moral clarity grows not from intensity, but from careful thought grounded in understanding, context, and evidence. The shortcut that makes past emotions predict the future. At some point, a feeling from the past quietly steps into the future before you do. You have not decided anything yet, but your body already has. A familiar tension shows up, a heaviness, a sense of dread or resignation, and suddenly the future feels predictable. You think, I already know how this will go. That certainty feels earned. After all, you have felt this before. And last time, the outcome hurt. Here is the shock. The brain is not predicting the future. It is replaying the past and calling it foresight. The brain is designed to learn from emotional experience. When something leads to pain or relief, the emotional memory gets stored with priority, not as a detailed record, but as a pattern. When a similar situation appears, the brain pulls the pattern forward instantly. The feeling arrives before conscious thought, and the feeling feels like a warning. This is efficient. Emotional memory is fast. It saves energy. If something hurt before, the brain assumes it will hurt again. That assumption once kept humans alive, but it also turns past emotion into a false crystal ball. The brain does not ask how similar this situation really is. It asks, does it feel familiar? Familiarity is enough. If the emotional texture matches, the brain predicts the same ending. It treats the feeling as evidence of what is coming. That is where the shortcut lies. When an old emotion shows up, the brain assumes it is detecting a pattern in reality, not in memory. The feeling feels like intuition, like insight, like experience speaking, but often it is just a past reaction being recycled. This is why people say things like, I can tell how this will end, or this always happens to me. The brain has confused emotional memory with inevitability. The past feeling becomes the future forecast. Emotion makes this convincing because it arrives with urgency. The body reacts. Muscles tense. The nervous system prepares. Preparation feels like intelligence. The brain thinks it is being smart by getting ahead of the pain. But preparation based on outdated data is not wisdom. It is inertia. Memory plays a crucial role here. Emotional memories are stored differently than neutral ones. They are generalized. The brain remembers how it felt more than what actually happened. Context fades. Differences blur. Only the emotional conclusion remains. So when something in the present triggers a similar feeling, the brain skips analysis and jumps to outcome. Last time I felt this way, it ended badly. Therefore, this will too. The logic feels airtight because it is emotional, not analytical. The brain also prefers consistency. Predicting the same outcome feels stable. It reinforces a coherent story about who you are and how life works. Changing the prediction would require updating identity. That takes effort and creates uncertainty. So the brain sticks with what it knows, even if what it knows is pain. This shortcut is especially powerful after repeated emotional experiences. If you have been disappointed several times, the disappointment becomes anticipatory. The emotion shows up early. The brain calls that realism. But it is not realism. It is conditioning. Fear is the most obvious example. If a situation once triggered fear, the fear will likely return before the situation fully unfolds again. The brain assumes the fear means danger is present. It does not check whether circumstances have changed. It trusts the feeling because it kept you safe before. But sadness does this too. So does shame. So does rejection. Emotional patterns harden into expectations. Expectations shape behavior. Behavior then creates outcomes that match the expectation. The loop closes. This is how emotional predictions become self-fulfilling. The brain feels certain, so you act cautiously, defensively, or withdrawn. The situation responds to that energy. The outcome resembles the past. The brain says, "See, I was right." What it does not see is its own role in shaping the result. The brain rarely notices this because the emotional prediction feels passive. It feels like something that happened to you, not something you did. The feeling just showed up, but the feeling arrived carrying a story about the future. Breaking this shortcut does not mean ignoring emotional memory. Emotional memory contains useful information. The problem is treating it as a prophecy rather than a reference. The shift begins when you notice when a feeling claims to know what comes next. That internal sentence, "This will end badly." Pause there. Ask whether the feeling is about now or about before. Often the emotion is a memory echo. It belongs to a different time, a different version of you, a different context. The brain does not update emotional memory easily. It needs conscious intervention. When you name the feeling as familiar rather than predictive, it loses authority. You can say, "I have felt this before," without saying, "I know what will happen." That small distinction creates space. In that space, new outcomes become possible. The brain can learn something different. Emotional memory can update, but only if it is allowed to see new endings. If you have ever felt trapped by a sense that the future is already written, this is why. The brain took an old emotion, projected it forward, and called it certainty. It felt like experience. It felt like intuition. But it was just the past speaking louder than the present. Once you see that shortcut clearly, the future loosens. You still feel, you still remember, but you stop letting yesterday's emotions decide tomorrow before it even arrives. Why emotional closure often feels better than truth. There is a specific kind of relief that arrives when a story finally ends. When you decide why something happened. When you settle on an explanation. When the loose ends stop pulling at your mind. Even if the explanation hurts, even if it is unfair, it feels better than not knowing. That feeling is closure, and it can feel almost addictive. The brain craves closure because open questions keep the nervous system activated. Unfinished stories linger. They demand attention. They drain energy. So when the mind finds an answer, any answer, the body relaxes. Muscles loosen, thoughts slow down. That physical relief feels like resolution. Here is the shock. That relief has nothing to do with whether the explanation is true. The brain does not reward accuracy in moments of emotional uncertainty. It rewards certainty. Closure provides certainty. Truth often does not. Truth can be complex, ambiguous, or incomplete. Closure is clean. It closes the loop. When something painful happens, and there is no clear explanation, the brain feels exposed. It does not know how to protect you from a repeat, so it rushes to assign meaning. This happened because of this. This ended because of that. The explanation becomes a shield. Even self-blame can feel comforting. Saying it was my fault hurts, but it gives the pain a container. Randomness does not. Unanswered questions leave the pain floating. Closure pins it down. Emotion drives this process. Strong feelings demand resolution. The brain treats emotional discomfort as a problem to be solved immediately. Closure solves it quickly by creating a narrative that stops the emotional search. This is why people often accept the first explanation that feels emotionally complete. It does not have to be accurate, just has to feel settled. The moment the story feels whole, the brain stops asking questions. Memory reinforces this preference. The brain remembers how uncomfortable uncertainty felt and how relieving closure felt. Next time, it reaches for closure faster. Over time, the habit strengthens. The brain learns that ending the story matters more than refining it. Closure also protects identity. Unresolved truth can challenge how you see yourself or others. It can introduce doubt. Closure preserves a stable self-image. Even if the story is painful, it is familiar. Familiar pain feels safer than unknown truth. There is also a social component. Closure makes emotions easier to explain to others. It gives you a reason. People respond better to reasons than to uncertainty. Validation arrives. The brain interprets that validation as confirmation that the story is correct. Truth rarely arrives with validation. It may isolate you. It may complicate conversations. Closure simplifies them. The brain prefers simplicity, especially under emotional load. The danger is that emotional closure often freezes learning. Once the story is closed, new information feels threatening. It tries to reopen something the brain worked hard to seal. So it gets ignored or resisted. This is how misunderstandings persist for years. How false narratives about relationships, failures, or missed opportunities become fixed. The emotional relief of closure outweighed the discomfort of continued inquiry. The brain also confuses emotional peace with correctness. When the mind quiets down, it feels like resolution. But calm is not proof. It is just a state of the nervous system. Truth often keeps things slightly unsettled. It leaves room for nuance. It admits missing pieces. It does not always offer emotional comfort. The brain does not find that rewarding in the short term. This is why people sometimes avoid revisiting old explanations even when evidence changes. Reopening the story reactivates the original discomfort. The brain remembers that pain and resists it. Emotional closure can even feel moral. It feels responsible, decisive, like moving on. Questioning closure can feel like being stuck. The brain equates finality with growth. But growth often requires unfinished stories. It requires holding uncertainty longer than feels comfortable. Letting explanations remain provisional. That goes against the brain's default strategy. The shift begins when you notice how good closure feels. That relief is the signal. It tells you the nervous system just powered down. Instead of assuming the story is true, pause and ask what discomfort it relieved. Often closure answered an emotional need, not a factual one. The need for safety, for control, for coherence. That does not make it wrong, but it makes it incomplete. You can allow closure to soothe without letting it harden into truth. You can say this explanation helps me cope without saying this is definitely what happened. That distinction keeps the door open. Over time, the brain can learn that not every story needs to end cleanly, that you can function with partial answers, that uncertainty does not equal danger. If you have ever chosen an explanation because it let you finally breathe, this is why. Emotional closure quieted the system. It felt better than truth because truth was still unfinished. Once you see that shortcut, you gain a choice. You can still let closure calm you, but you no longer have to mistake relief for reality. And in that space, truth can emerge slowly, imperfectly, but without being rushed out by the need to feel okay right now. How the brain accepts emotional explanations without proof. There is a moment when an explanation lands and it just fits. You feel it settle into place. The tension drops. The confusion fades. You stop searching. You might not have evidence, but you have something better in that moment. You have emotional sense-making, and the brain accepts it immediately. You do not say, "I need proof." You say, "That makes sense," and the story becomes real. The brain is not built to demand evidence first. It is built to reduce discomfort. When something emotional happens and you do not understand why, the uncertainty creates pressure. The mind stays active. The body stays alert. An explanation ends that state. Any explanation that feels coherent will do. Here is the shock. The brain treats emotional coherence as credibility. If an explanation aligns with how you feel, the brain assumes it must be accurate. Feeling becomes the filter. If the story explains the emotion endorses the story. No external proof required. This happens because emotions signal relevance. When you feel something strongly, the brain assumes it is important. Important things need explanations. Once an explanation matches the emotional intensity, the brain relaxes. The loop closes. The brain does not naturally separate emotional satisfaction from truth. When an explanation reduces emotional discomfort, the nervous system calms. That calm feels like resolution. Resolution feels like correctness. This is why people accept explanations that confirm their feelings even when facts are missing. If you feel rejected, an explanation that blames distance or intention feels right. If you feel anxious, an explanation that predicts danger feels logical. The explanation is judged by how well it fits the feeling, not by how well it fits reality. The brain evolved this shortcut because in many situations, emotion was a reliable guide. Fear often did mean danger. Disgust often did mean contamination. Anger often did mean threat or unfairness. Acting quickly mattered more than analyzing deeply. But the modern world is filled with abstract situations, social dynamics, delayed outcomes, hidden variables. The emotional system still reacts, but its explanations are no longer automatically reliable. Emotion also fills gaps in information. When details are missing, the brain does not wait, it invents. Emotional explanations are fast because they require no verification. They just need to feel plausible. Memory strengthens this habit. When an emotional explanation seems to work, the brain remembers the relief. It forgets whether the explanation was ever tested. Over time, the brain learns that emotional sense-making is enough. There is also an identity factor. Emotional explanations often protect how you see yourself. They preserve consistency. If something went wrong, an explanation that aligns with your self-image feels safer. The brain favors stories that do not disrupt identity. Social validation adds another layer. When others agree with your emotional explanation, it feels confirmed. The brain confuses agreement with evidence. Shared belief creates confidence. Confidence feels like proof. This is why emotional explanations spread easily. They are intuitive. They are relatable. They require no data. They just need resonance. When many people feel the same way, the explanation feels undeniable. The danger is that emotional explanations close inquiry. Once the story feels right, the brain stops looking. New information feels unnecessary or threatening. The explanation becomes a conclusion rather than a hypothesis. This is how misunderstandings persist, how assumptions harden, how false narratives about motives intentions, and outcomes become fixed. The brain chose comfort over verification. Emotional explanations also feel urgent. They arrive quickly and demand acceptance. Slower explanations feel weak by comparison. The brain equates speed with insight. If an explanation comes instantly, it feels like intuition rather than guesswork. But intuition without feedback is just repetition. The shift begins when you notice how an explanation feels rather than what it proves. When a story brings relief, ask what discomfort it resolved. Often it resolved uncertainty, not truth. You can let an explanation soothe without letting it settle permanently. You can hold it lightly. You can say this is one possible story rather than this is what happened. The brain resists this at first because uncertainty reactivates discomfort. But with practice, the nervous system learns that it can tolerate not knowing. The urgency fades. Emotions still matter. They signal what you care about. They highlight impact. But they are not evidence on their own. They are starting points, not verdicts. If you have ever believed something simply because it explained how you felt, this is why. The brain accepted emotional coherence as proof. It chose resolution over investigation. Once you see that shortcut, explanations lose their automatic authority. You still feel them. You still consider them. But you no longer mistake emotional fit for factual truth. And in that space, understanding becomes something you build, not something you accept just because it feels right.